Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D in WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the movie of What If Deku Was an Alien's Worst Nightmare. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The deep, soundless territories of space was home to many systems which then housed their own planets. And within those planets were innumerable quantities of possible sentience, all with varying technologies and resources. It should be no surprise that as species advanced and broke through their systems and visited others, that soon an overarching system would be placed, a way to regulate and prevent mass extinction that was caused by some others. Isewa was a part of this system. However, he was individually contracted through another, one that granted him freedom from the HPSC laws and such. UA, also known as United Alliance, a specialized wing of heroes trained by UA alumni, separated from HPSC and instead licensed separately. Only a couple were accepted into the ranks every few spatial turns, a small amount, considering the number of requests received, at least. Isewa was given his roster, and the next rotation, he was greeted by the traveling freighter, no doubt holding his prospective students, all 20 of them, under his care for the next 18 leaps. As his students exited the frigate and entered their home, Isewa felt the thick fur on his neck slowly begin to raise. Something was brewing, and for some unknown reason, his students seemed to be at the center of it all. Somehow, they were caught within the middle of whatever may or may not be occurring. Isewa didn't like it. He turned his attention back to his students. With 20 varied species, all from backgrounds and lands that Isewa doesn't bother to comprehend, his class was easily made up of purse chaos. The one a wing was always made up of the more volatile species, younglings that his other companions were unable or unwilling to host properly, leaving it to him. It was only when all were off the freighter that he began to speak. Listen up. He growled past the cacophony. I expect you all to exhibit some sort of restraint and attempt to work with your peers. He focused his vermilion-tinted glare on a few possible students that could cause trouble. He'd not gotten such a volatile species in a while. It was a clear challenge from Nezu, Katsuki Bakugo, a trinitrox, a sentient that was born for wars. Only 2 before him were ever known to be on the side of the heroes. The rest preferred to stay upon their own planet in battle for pride and glory. He was aggressive and brash, but he exuded power and confidence from such an unknown sector. He would grow to be a phenomenal specimen, a true sign of what one could be. The only problem, his attitude. Katsuki had adjusted the required suit without clear approval and was currently sneering at another student, who, thankfully, seemed not to care. You do not need to become best friends, but I expect you all to respect one another and learn to work together when required. He added, 20 students to keep watch on. Isewa sighed as he led his students to their hangars and the connected dorm rooms. However, as heroes under UA, you will all be expected to work as a unit when the situation calls for it. I will be splitting you all into your own squadrons within the next cycles. I will be observing your training before assigning you all to the best matches for your trainings. They followed behind him like younglings as he slowly toured throughout the base and where they would be staying. The many amenities, from their own dorms to a fully stocked canteen that connected into a blank slate of an all-purpose room. They had full autonomy of their living situation, and it wouldn't be long before the class realized it. For the time being, though, Isewa took them down beneath the living quarters to the attached hangar. These are extensions of yourself, he said as he stalked forward to press a series of buttons. He stood passively. The slight displace of pressure and the thickening of air was the only sign that he did anything, until the lights flickered on, showcasing what it was that Isewa had done. 20 small spheres rested upon a series of pedestals. These, he gestured to the spheres, are synthetic eggs. We no longer have access to the previous ship-faring organisms, but these are the next best plan. They will grow to fit your needs and adjust to whomever imprints on the egg. 20 of them, 1 for each student. After millennia of wars and planetary genocides, most species that could connect to their crafts were killed or enslaved, leaving very few still alive and on the side of the heroes, and those that were unable to be wiped for a new pilot, and instead they waited and refused every attempt at wiping. Isewa continued, you will all care for your synthetics. They may not be fully sentient, but they still have a sense of self. With that said, he gestured for each student to come forward and claim a synthetic egg as their own. Once every student had one in their palms, Isewa closed the entryway to the incubating chambers where the eggs once were. You will, however, be using the training crafts while your synthetic ship grows and adjusts. The groans and mumbled complaints were expected. They happened every time he had to break the news that the student couldn't just take the newly hatched ship out for a spin. Damn, I wanted to take this dude out for a swing. One student sighed, amongst the snickers of the others around them. Isewa ignored them and watched them interact with the eggs. Some students held the egg like it would shatter at the slightest pressure, whilst others decided to test the strength of the shell. Isewa understood their fears. His own ship was an incomplete synthetic, one of the first purposefully manufactured synthetics, and it was to be scrapped. However, he would forever deny it. Isewa felt something for the inanimate craft and decided to claim it as his own. He watched as his students slowly bonded with their unhatched synth crafts, a slight smile pulling at his lips. No matter what may occur, he would not let this squad down. Just like how Ursa H had been a pillar of strength, he would do the same for his students. Katsuki was considered royalty. His scale pattern was intricate, and his horns and spines were sprawling. Not like his playmates who only had pathetic nubs on their brows. His were fully sprouted and curled thrice over. The blood of the chieftain ran through him. He did not get the lust for battle though. Katsuki was more content to watch the fights that would break out. Bulls posturing for their does as they fought anything they could. With a sickening crack and a soft squeal, Katsuki watched his most recent playmate get their spine snapped by a posturing bull, trying to impress the others. His friend was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Katsuki had been passing by, one clawed hand held in his dams. They saw the entire ordeal. Why did they kill him? Katsuki stared at the still warm corpse of his friend. He'd prodded it with a stick before his dam snatched it from his claws with a snarl on her lips. Don't do that. She'd hissed at him, her own hand tightening around his own. Was he evil? Katsuki mourned the loss of his poking stick. Instead, he could only question the motives. No, he was just a hatchling. His mother sighed in response and loosened her bone-crushing grip. He grimaced. So, why'd they kill him? He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, was her only response. Any attempt made by him to get more answers were swiftly deflected or twisted into something else entirely. Eventually, Katsuki let it go. He would never forget the sound of the spine breaking. Isewa was right. His instincts were going haywire the entire time, and he finally figured out why. For whatever reason, villains had taken an interest in his squadron, and after an attack that left him and a fellow captain injured, he could only hope that they would not be keen on trying again. Of course, he was wrong, for whatever being out there was not pleased with him. Isewa grit his teeth. He had lost a student, one of his top students no less. This was a stain, one he'd never be rid of unless he got Katsuki back. One moment Katsuki was piloting his training ship, a standard exercise to grow more comfortable with the movements of the craft, something all new recruits go through. What they don't go through is high-stakes battles happening out of almost nowhere. It happened almost instantaneously, with a fleet of unknown crafts warping in around his own, separating him from possible assistance and pulling his own training craft into a sort of whirlpool from the sheer speeds he was pushed around. Somehow, in that instance, Katsuki was captured. He had awoken to the rough removal of his weapons, and spitting globs of venom at his capturers did almost nothing, except when he got it in the eye of one of the idiots. That was satisfying. His satisfaction didn't last long, however. They threw him in a wide cage. It was cold, the chill causing his scales to darken. Any attempt to keep some sort of heat within his body. It was damp and sucked any possible heat from his body. It didn't help that when he'd been captured, his temperature-regulating uniform was replaced with what could be considered mere rags. Katsuki gnashed his teeth in agitation. This whole situation was shitty. He was locked up without any of his peers or even his teacher to help him. For the first time since his indoctrination into Squadron 1A, Katsuki was alone. It scared him more than he would like to admit. He curled himself up as tightly as he could, and he would never admit it, but in his mind, he keened and cried for his dam. Somewhere in the deep recesses of celestial space, a territory unexplored, a drifting creature flutters its atom-thin wings. Across the galaxies it is felt in a different way. No one would suspect a simple space butterfly to cause such damage, if one were to say it were the actual cause of this damage. The destruction of the largest known war fleet possessed by every no-sentient was broadcasted across all galaxies. The species of sentients that were like parasites. They needed a host to even function. And for millennia they've been conquering and embedding themselves into other species, slowly tearing their minds apart until it was only the parasitic sentient controlling the body. Nothing could stand in the way of their terroristic reign. With nearly a fourth of known galactic superclusters under their command, the Meticularies were the true rulers of the universe. For so long they'd been undefeated, until they came across what the rudimentary sentients called Earth. Earth was a recently discovered planet in an unmapped solar system. It was no surprise, though, that no one had yet to make contact. It was unknown how the Earth sentients would react, if there were sentients, so instead Earth was placed on a watch list. It was constantly supervised and studied closely. Only when the Commission deemed it safe would there be any attempts at contact between the possible sentients and the heroes. The hyperspectral environmental research opportunities through exemplary sentience team that would be deployed to act as the first contact. So, when the Meticularies turned their eyes on Earth, it was assumed that all those sentients would be killed. The HPSC even went so far as to remove Earth from the list of planets with possible untouched sentience. It had happened before. There was no way to stop the Meticularies' conquest once they set their sights on something. There was complete silence from Earth. an oddity considering the meticulary form of bragging. The Emperor would return within the flesh of the newly destroyed sentients. It was hierarchical, in that the upper brass was allowed to get the cream of the crop. Those closest to the Emperor were given the opportunity to take over the newly imprisoned species. Then they would broadcast it, slowly closing the gap between the HPSC's own territory. However, the gloating transmission was never sent out. The earthen sentients survived. Somehow the sentients that inhabited Earth defeated the fleet of a possible hundreds of millions tethered meticularies and many more untethered meticularies, a feat that hadn't been accomplished. In fact, only one ship had escaped the failed attempt, the Emperor of his species. He'd only been able to implant himself before his forces and kin were overrun. After that, he vanished. No one could find him if anyone were to attempt to look, that is. Following that event, the sentients that inhabited Earth were feared, and for good reason. After that event, named Destruction of Meta 475, Earth was condemned, deemed hostile. No one wanted to fight whatever species that could take down the former militaristic sentients that ruled over any sentients they come across. The entire galaxy was deemed a dead zone. No patrols would enter, and any ship seen exiting the dead borders would be shot on sight. It was the only hope that the Earth sentients would not leave their home planet. The hall was a cacophony of noises, day in and day out. Howls and wails echoed throughout the chambers. The misery of the occupants was clear for all to hear. Many knew that they would die within this ship, away from their kin and loved ones, so all they could do was mourn. Rare sentients and species from multiple galaxies were housed within this hall. From the heavily plated Zesek, who could harden the skin on their bodies and tear apart anything with near absolute ease, to the smaller and meeker Faust, small skittish creatures that house special glands within their throats that are often used for decorative skins or components for more important objects. Never before had this hallway housed a sentient from D-Meta 475 seconds known solar system. DM poaching was an offense punishable by death. Very few sentients took part in the DM trade, as it had very little payoff, and if caught the punishments were worse than the possible rewards. The dead zone was monitored constantly, and there were always heroes ships nearby to enforce the HPSC's will. Despite all of that, the few DMs that had been poached and were within the stars were highly sought after and often caused bargaining wars that could end up in the winner shelling out millions of credits, all for one specific creature. It was no surprise how the illegal trade wanted DM sentients. Very little was known about their mannerisms, but it was determined that they were a pack species of sentients. There was an attempt to capture DM spawnlings and force them to imprint on their master and work as a sort of savage pet. Those plans never came to fruition. All captured DM spawn died within days. Some lasted a few weeks, but none lasted long enough to adulthood. DM sentients were rare and desired by those willing to get their hands mudded in the process. But the process it took to procure one was almost impossible, leaving them few and far between. The only way to get a fresh one was to take it from the source. Within the frigate were the guards, many composed of the scurvy race, a more insectoid sort of species with 4 arms. 2 primary larger arms and 2 secondary smaller, weaker arms were tasked with caring for all the prisoners within the cargo bay. This extra dexterity made them perfect in this sort of situation. They were the keepers of this hallway of despair. And now, they were able to witness the first DM sentient this side of the stars. It's so thin. One of the guards poked the squishy flesh with a thin claw, its head tilting in fascination. Stop poking it. The other guard slapped the hand away from the sedated sentient. It could infect you with some sort of poison. They shivered and glared at the DM sentient as though it would do anything. You think it would remember us when the big boss trains it? The first guard questioned their companion. No clue. Those things never the same after overhauls conditioning. They shook their secondary arms. Now let's get this over with. It's given me the heebies. Currently, the unknown sentient was under heavy sedatives that would give them enough time to find a suitable cell and get out before it even got close to awakening. It had been given the highest dosage of estrazole possible. There was no known record of how the medication would react within a DM. No one aboard the ship wanted to risk it awakening prematurely. There's no empty cells that we can spare for it. One of the others clacked their mandibles irritably. We'll have to put it with others and hope it doesn't kill them before boss can examine the goods. All of them are prey species. This beast will kill him the moment it wakes. One rumbled. Fine then. With a click of mandibles, the guard pushing the table moved on, away from the cage they'd been contemplating moments before. I've got the perfect cage for this one. They ultimately placed the DM sentient in the largest cell, the one which currently housed an odd, a trinitrox and a pulvis. What if it damages the pulvis? The combative guard threw their forelimbs into the air. We'd be killed, and he'd wear our chitin as a cape. They spat a glob of acid and glared at their companion. The partis is attached to the pulvis. No way it would let this thing. They shoved the sedated sentient, attacked the little thing. Not to mention the trinitrox. No doubt it would kill the thing first. They pushed open the cell and snapped their mandibles in a rhythmic pattern. The sound of a lock was heard, and the group of guards shoved their way into the cell. They were uncertain with how long the metasentient would be knocked out, and they didn't want it to awaken while they were still placing it in a cell. It was best to get it in the cage as quickly as possible. No one on board knew the mistake they had just made. Katsuki had lost count of the time he was imprisoned on this forsaken ship. His cell lacked any sign of time changes, and the air inside was clearly filtered, offering no sense of direction. He couldn't taste the freshness. Instead, it held a sterilized, yet stale, taste to it. With those conditions, it was no surprise that time began to blend together. He would sleep more often than not, leaving him disoriented and lethargic. His schedule was thrown off, however, when his cell door began to open. Useless, he was useless. Katsuki could only glare at those entering his cell. With the cuffs and inhibitors pushing through his scales, he was almost completely useless. And both he and his captors were aware of it. Perhaps that is why they felt so comfortable walking into his cell when any other time they might have been more wary. It's big enough of a cell. The trinitrox is half dead anyways. It wouldn't hurt the cargo. I still don't trust it. Here, look. Katsuki gnashed his teeth at the sentient that began to advance on him. But he did nothing else. The segment of metal he was on had heated only slightly thanks to painful usages of his inner sparks, and he was not keen on moving and causing the heat to dissipate. See, the creature backed off and turned to its companions. Completely harmless. It hasn't moved from that spot unless it can't reach the food or has to expel waste. It won't do anything to the boss' prized possession. If this goes wrong, you're the one answering to the boss. The other clacked their mandibles irritably. Deal. And with that, the two backed out of his cage, leaving Katsuki alone once more. This time, however, he was wary. For some reason they'd walked in, had some back and forth, then just left. His questions were answered during the next mealtime when his cage was once again reopened. This time the two sentients from before were dragging along another, a thin pulvis. They were dragging it by the frail horn that protruded from its brow, and the sight of that made Katsuki's own blood boil. Here you go. New home. The one dragging her tossed her in none too gently and slammed the cage behind her. That left Katsuki face to face with the shivering pulvis. Her body was small and thin. No doubt from whatever she had been through whilst imprisoned. She was skittish. With a muffled whimper she scurried to the corner furthest from him. Katsuki couldn't blame her. On any other occasion he would rather die than let another close to him. But now he was in a situation where he could possibly die. And that is the only time his pride will fold. Katsuki was awoken once more by the sound of his cell opening. He didn't bother raising his head from where it was pillowed on his arms. Whatever it was wouldn't be worth the lost heat. Katsuki. The voice was familiar, yet faint. What have you bastards done to him? There was a heavy thump, and not long after Katsuki felt something around him. If he were more aware, he might have fought against it, but as it was, he was too weak, and whatever it was so warm that he leaned into it. He was just so cold. After the capture of his student, Isewa refused to return back to the hangar. He went far enough for Yamda to take over the escort duty, then immediately turned and began to track the waves of space. His original plan was to free his temperamental student, not get captured as well. Isewa was furious when he was finally escorted to the cell his student has been kept in. It had been nearly 14 full cycles since Katsuki had gone missing, 4 since Isewa was captured himself. The chill of the cell was Katsuki's weakness wasn't a surprise. The cell was at temperatures that made Isewa's fur prickle, but Katsuki. He was a reptilian race, and although he secreted flammable substances, Katsuki was unable to produce his own warmth. One of his biggest weaknesses, however, it was easy to circumvent with the regulated uniforms. If he had the uniform at least, Isewa felt the softest sob against his ruff, and it took everything within him not to try to kill the patrolling guards. I'm here, Katsuki, he murmured into the scales of his student. Isewa turned his attention to the other occupant of their cell. A young pulvis was shivering in the corner, and Isewa didn't think before he began to reach towards her with his unoccupied paw. He only stopped when she flinched and shuffled away. I'm not gonna hurt you, he murmured and began to reach just a bit further before stopping. He left his paw pads facing upwards, so it was her choice whether or not to come closer. My name is Isewa, he began. I came here to rescue my student, and I'm still going to. He looked at her, and he felt a purr behind to bubble in his throat. We won't leave without you. That seemed to be all she needed to hear. Once the words passed his lips, she all but threw herself at him, a broken sob coming from her throat. SHH, you are safe now. He ran his paws over her thin hair, minding the frail horn. You're safe with us. He felt her grip tighten and moved her to sit on his lap in response. They stayed like that for an indeterminate amount of time. It was only broken when Katsuki's eyes slowly opened. Isewa, he slurred, as his brow furrowed. What are you doing here? I came to get you. He snorted. Didn't expect to get captured myself. Katsuki huffed a breath. Yeah, his voice was soft. Almost a whisper. Thank you for coming for me. Isewa took the role of a sort of guardian for the young pulvis, which he soon learned was named. His mouth was filled with iron as he choked down the synthetic meal they were provided with. Kiri didn't seem to care about the taste as she shoveled the food into her mouth, barely pausing to swallow each mouthful before adding another. Katsuki was just finishing his own portion before he grimaced and began to drink from the cylinders they were provided. Within it was a thick fluid that tasted and reeked of dock. Whatever was in it made Isewa's body lethargic and heavy, clearly drugged, but they were not in a position to refuse it. Isewa was unsure of how long they had been here until a new occupant was placed with them. It had broken the routine that had been going on for at least 5 cycles before his own arrival as well. The first sign was the guards milling about. They were peering into each cell available before clicking in their own language. Each subsequent cell led to more agitated voices and shouts until finally, they stopped at the cell containing the trinitrox, pardus, and pulvis. Just place it in here. It's a carnivorous species, but the pulvis should be fine if it stays away. Boss won't care much about the other 2, they were accidental anyways. Their cell door was creaked open, and 4 guards stepped in, 2 wielding batons that arced with dangerous electricity while another 2 rushed in with a type of gurney. Isewa couldn't get a good enough look at whatever the creature was, but he winced at the drug on the gelatinous bag taped to its arm. Through the dim lighting he could barely see the outline of the word, estrazel, a drug that in small doses could knock out even the hardiest of species. 1 small drop of it could instantly knock out Katsuki if it were to enter his bloodstream, a feat in of itself. The guards were quick in lowering the figure to the floor of the cell. Their movements were rushed and slightly panicked. Whatever it was, the guards weren't keen on being around it for too long. Once they had collected their items and rushed out, Isewa made no move to investigate. He was wary but believed that whatever it was that was dumped in with them would remain as still as a corpse. They could investigate and deal with their newest cellmate later. Exhaustion was hitting him full force, and it took everything within him to remain somewhat aware. His upper set of eyes closed whilst the secondary pair beneath remained open just enough to see any movement that may be perceived as a threat. With that, Isewa slowly let rest overcome him. He could still perceive movement through the lower pair, and he made sure to tuck both Iri and Katsuki closer to his own form. The silence of their cell was broken all too soon by a harsh gasp, but not one from the pulvis who dozed drearily beside him. No, it came from his trinitrox student, one who had never made that sort of noise in Isewa's presence before. That knowledge had the pardus shooting up, shaking off the comforting blanket that had been rest in favor of seeking what made his student make that noise. His eyes glowed red and yellow as he searched for the possible threat. He turned his attention to Katsuki, however, when his student tugged lightly at his mane. "It's a human." Katsuki's voice was a whisper as he pointed a claw in the direction of the body the guards had dropped off an indeterminate time before, and it was then that Isewa noticed how his student had huddled closer, away from the possible threat, something he could think on later. They had a bigger problem on their hands. He'd have to interrogate Katsuki's knowledge of the sentient species name and how the younger knew it. Their newest cellmate was shifting. Clearly, they were beginning to shake off the effects of the drugs, which was shocking. With such a powerful medication, they should have been out for almost 2 more full cycles, maybe even more. Instead, they were slowly waking from only a few hours under its influence. The changes were minute at first. The breathing slowly quickened and changed from measured even breathing to slightly uneven and more shallow breaths. However, it wasn't long as soon enough it began to twitch and grumble, its face contorting in odd ways that had Isewa on edge in an instant. It wasn't until bright green eyes snapped open and the human shifted in an aborted lunge towards the nearest exit. Both Isewa and Katsuki winced as it slammed into the bars, a sharp crack resonating as the human staggered back before falling on its rump with a pained groan. Isewa wasn't sure how humans normally looked, but this one was so small. It looked nothing like the ways that books and lesson plans had depicted it. He had imagined a great hulking beast with flesh-rending claws and massive jaws that could snap one in twain. Not this. It looked soft and meek, not at all like the stories. Hell, it looked weaker than a Faust, and those were often seen as lowest of the low. The way it looked made Isewa want to question all regulations placed upon this supposed dangerous species. Only cycles upon cycles of conditioning made Isewa keep his guard up. "Be careful," he murmured to his 2 charges with an almost urgent tone. Isewa wasn't sure how this human would react when it saw them, but he could only hope that it wasn't like those monsters that they'd be led to believe. Humans aren't very well known or documented. I don't know how it'll react. He placed a paw on the 2 and gently ushered them behind him. The human noticed them soon after it stopped groaning in pain, though it continued to rub uselessly at its face. Isewa was unsure for what reason, though. Meaningless chatters and burbles came from its mouth. Its eyes moved about the cell as it made those meaningless noises. However, there was no attempt from it to speak basic, a language all space-faring occupants are required to learn, and it seemed to wait for a response from the other occupants. Isewa frowned at it. "We don't know what you're trying to say." He spoke slowly in basic, hoping it might know even a lick of the registered language. The human's eyes snapped back to his and the 2 were caught in a staring contest. The fur on Isewa's neck rippling with unease. The human had yet to act aggressively, but he was getting increasingly nervous the longer they stared another down. Just as he was preparing to make some sort of noise to make the human back down, it detached its gaze. Isewa felt like he had lost despite the human looking away first. Instead, it turned vivid green eyes on the other two that peeked out from behind his larger form. He growled, Katsuki unconsciously mirroring the sound, when the human's eyes stayed trained on Eri longer than a single glimpse. Throughout this entire process, his muscles were tensed, prepared to fight if the human were to act aggressively. Except, it did no such thing. Instead, it chattered to itself some more before shuffling into a corner and curling up, somehow compacting its form in a way that made it almost the same size as Eri. The cell held a tense air for an indiscernible amount of time, with the three huddling together, providing a united front should anything happen. Nothing happened until mealtime was announced by the screeching of old wheels down the hall. The human pushed itself closer to where the latch was open for the trays to be pushed through, alongside fluid bottles that would be rolled in after. It chattered as it pressed its face against the bars close by the latch. You should move. Isewa wasn't sure why he was attempting to warn the human. Maybe it was because they were trapped together and he had no desire to be near an agitated human, or perhaps a sign of goodwill that they won't hurt it as long as it doesn't hurt them. Of course, none of that mattered since the human simply cocked its head at him, large green eyes giving it an almost cute look, and burbled a bit before returning to squishing its face against the bars of the cell. The food tray cart had arrived at their cell, and the guard clacked their mandibles in annoyance when it saw the human pressed against the bars. Move, it barked in Basic. The human doesn't understand Basic. Isewa regretted it the moment he said so, for the guard merely grinned and pulled out a high-voltage stun baton. Well, it's a good thing that pain is universal, ha, and slammed the weapon against the bars of the cage. The human yelped and threw itself back with extremely fast reflexes that even made Katsuki hiss in surprise. It didn't move fast enough. They could see that the electricity arcing off the cell door had made contact with one of its hands. But instead of being completely immobilized by the voltage, the human merely grunted and stuck its finger in its mouth, glaring at the guard as it slowly backed away from the cell door, meaningly burbles and snarls escaping past its lips as it continued to suck on its own finger. Somehow the human was completely fine even after taking a hit such as that. Isewa felt cold creeping up his spine to go against such a creature that was somehow immune to most of their weapons. He looked closer at it. No sort of blood or scales seemed to have been dislodged by the hit. It barely reacted, still moving oddly fluidly and crouching only a few meters away from the guard, as though it didn't care about the weapon they had. The guard merely played it off and waved their baton around a bit more before opening the latch and sliding through 4 trays and 4 fluid bottles. There was only one issue with this situation, though. The human was between them and their single provided meal. Large green eyes followed the movement of the guard as he slid each tray and bottle through the hatch. It didn't move away as the objects came flying towards it. It merely stopped them from moving any further with its uninjured hand. Throughout this, the human not once took its eyes off of the guard. Once the food had been deposited in their cell and the guard hurriedly shuffled away, Isewa saw the way Eri stared longingly at the puddle of gruel. Despite the food tasting like actual waste, she needed all the nutrients possible. Katsuki was in a similar predicament. With the lack of heat around him, his metabolism has started to slow, causing the trinitrox to slowly shut down. He'd need to eat a lot more now that he's warmer and his metabolism is slowly going back to normal. Isewa had to get their meals. He just wasn't sure how to with the other sentient blocking him from seamlessly grabbing the food. The human, in a stroke of good fortune, merely glanced down at the trays that had been pushed messily in the cell before snorting and snatching one of the fluid bottles. It stared at the food for a moment longer before moving to return to its corner. Except, to the shock of the 3 other sentients, it pushed their rations towards them with a soft chitter. That kind move was ruined when it bared its teeth, and immediately Katsuki snarled in response. Isewa slapped a paw over his charge's snout, but the damage had already been done. Green eyes reopened and the human's lips fell back over its teeth. The human tilted its head before huffing and shuffling back to its corner where it once more compressed itself and simply watched. They slept in shifts, and each time Isewa was awake, he would note the way the human had yet to move. Its eyes were partially closed, but its breathing indicated that it was still awake. Still too shallow and fast to match his knowledge of sleeping sentience. Occasionally it was burble and gesture uselessly at something unseen. Vibrant green eyes seemingly glowing in the dark as the human seemingly got more and more agitated. Isewa and his charges slept fitfully that night. They had survived their first day with this human. If only they knew what the second day would bring them. The human had fallen into a rest cycle, twitching intermittently and on some occasions jerking so violently it made Isewa's fur rise in alarm. Though it never once acted aggressively, it simply stayed in its corner, only breaking away from the wall to snatch one of their dirtied plastic trays and one of the empty thick glass fluid bottles. Katsuki snorted but didn't say anything regarding the human. If this were a normal situation, Isewa had no doubt that Katsuki would be posturing and attempting to establish his place above the human, but that was if they were at the hub. Instead, they were trapped within a cell that put the trainees at a distinct disadvantage. Katsuki instead chose to remain silent, not bothering with attempting to shout the human down. For all Katsuki seemed to care, the human could keep its odd prizes. If it wasn't aggressive, it could do as it pleased. It was perhaps 3 cycles since the human had been deposited within their cell that their routine changed. The 4 of them reached some sort of quiet peace. They didn't bother the human and the human didn't bother them. The calm of their prison was shattered when 4 guards pushed their way into the cell, with the largest one looming over them menacingly. Step away from the pulvis. Its basic was grating and sharp, accented by the intermittent shocks of its baton held in one of its smaller, secondary arms. Do not resist or we will use force. Isewa growled warningly and adjusted himself to stand in front of Eri. Katsuki joining his side seconds later, a fierce snarl upon his lips. Move aside. The largest guard swung their baton towards the trio, clacking its mandibles angrily. Isewa could feel Eri whimper and grip at his fur tighter, her small form shivering. Neither he nor Katsuki moved from their protective stances. They were at an impasse, and from the corner of his eyes, Isewa saw the human shifting around, its large eyes watching the interaction. There was no movement from either side until the captain swung his baton again. This time plasma jumping between sharpened prongs, no doubt a warning. Isewa shifted and prepared to attack. Katsuki tensing beside him. You asked for it. They clicked before swinging the baton in a wide arc. Isewa was hit first, and he couldn't stop the squeal that passed his lips at the force of the hit, followed by a weak hiss as hundreds of volts were discharged into his body. Katsuki suffering the same fate moments later. We don't like your kind. Always trying to act superior just because you saved something one time. They kicked at Isewa's down form and snatched Eri. The moment the guard placed its claws around her arm, though, everyone flinched at the sound of scuffling, followed by a roar as the forgotten and previously placid human made its presence known. Lunged towards the guard that had grabbed Eri and had been dragging her towards the other 3 guards and out of their shared cell. The human's face was downturned in a vicious snarl, showing off blunt teeth that often belonged to prey species with how dull they looked, almost as though it wouldn't be able to break through most hide. As Isewa thought that the human snapped its jaws down onto the arm of the guard, almost instantly severing it. He takes it back. Blunt teeth or no, that human is a fucking monster. It had its blunt, herbivorous-esque teeth clamped on the arm and only seemed to keep exerting pressure despite the flailing and screams of the guard. All present watched in horror as the arm was snapped with an audible srrak. The grotesque sound made even Katsuki cringe. The human wasn't done though. After spitting the severed arm, it detached itself and lunged at the next closest guard, its oddly shaped hands flexing as though they were clawed as the human snatched the baton from the belt of the unfortunate sentient and pressed the button on the side to activate it. Isewa shuffled Eri and Katsuki behind him. The scene was brutal. Most sentients would stop their attacks once the other gives up. Yet, no number of shouted pleas was able to rip the human from its current victim. The others had quickly backed out of the cell, too afraid of what might happen if they were to attempt to remove the human from their companion. It felt like eons before the human finally backed away, its victims bloodied and injured with their weapons and gear stripped from them and shoved towards the stunned trio. Isewa was barely able to catch the tossed contraband, which he hastily shoved behind him. The other 2 guards didn't notice that they were too busy attempting to remove their comrades. The human had retreated to its corner where it folded in on itself and closed its eyes slightly. Though still vigilant, Isewa could see just how much that whole encounter had taken out of the other. Before, its eyes were bright and vigilant, but now, the human looked as though it were running on fumes. Its body was hunched over, and it was huffing heavily, not aggressively, just heavily. It made his fur prickle. Isewa didn't notice Eri detaching herself from his side until it was too late. The small pulvis shot towards the human and grabbed its leg. Isewa made an aborted step forward, but he was too late. He could only watch in fear, afraid of what the human might do. Thank you. She squeezed its limb, her eyes watery as she sobbed against it. The human didn't act aggressively. Instead, it lowered itself and scooped Eri into its arms, cooing gently the entire time and making unintelligible babble, running its hands over her hair in a soothing motion as it rocked her back and forth. It was such a change from its disposition just moments before that Isewa and Katsuki took a moment to rationalize what they were seeing. Eri, step away from it. His breath was shaky. No, it's okay. See. She poked its face, and all it did was burble at her, baring its teeth. Except Eri didn't shy away. She attempted to do the same odd expression. Its face looks different. She was right, the way its lips curved slightly, and its brow was smooth with no aggressive furrows. In fact, it looked happy when it would do that odd motion. No hint of aggression lay in the act of baring its teeth, especially compared to before when it had actually bared its teeth. Still, Isewa grit out. He was nervous, and rightly so. All humans were seen as immediate threats, and after what they just witnessed, he didn't want Eri sitting right on top of it, no matter how placid it was acting. Izuku huffed in amusement at what he could only presume was a lecture coming from the black-furred feline creature. Izuku's mind supplied for him, and he nodded in understanding, filing that information away for a later date. He gently nudged the other alien towards the other two that were standing, tense and nervous, even though he meant them no harm, but he had no way of communicating that. Izuku was aware he was probably staring off into space, but that didn't matter. He was busy focused on the feeling of the sentience that shared his body. Its purr was the only affirmation he received, and moments later he could feel a thread pull from him to the leader of the alien group. Isewa jolted in surprise nearly hours after the mess earlier. He'd hoped to get some rest while Katsuki fiddled with the contraband behind him and rewatched the human. Even though it was simply staring off into space, its face changing and contorting in odd manners, he wasn't sure how to feel about it. On one paw the human had saved Eri, but on the other paw he wasn't sure how to act around it without possibly setting it off. It didn't speak basic, and he didn't speak the odd garbled language of humans. They were at an impasse. Isewa shot up, his eyes glowing red as he glared around for the possible threat. He hadn't recognized that voice, and it scared him more than he'd like to admit. Wah! Out of the corner of his eyes, Isewa saw the human shuffle. It was staring at him unnervingly, a knowing glint in its eyes. Was that you? He felt stupid talking to it since it didn't understand him. But that was the only other sentient in their prison. But as far as he had known, humans were unable to speak telepathically. You can speak. The human tilted its head, its eyes squinted in thought before it hesitantly nodded. Its expressions matched the words that he heard. So somehow this human could communicate with him. But only him. The other two sentients were staring at him as though he were crazy. Can you? The door to their cell slammed open, and their meal for the day was hastily shoved in before the section of that gate was immediately shut. The guard was rushed and didn't notice the contraband in the cage. Even if it had, it probably wouldn't have done anything. News of the human attack had spread throughout the frigate, and no one wanted to go near the cage that housed it. The human only grabbed a fluid bottle before shuffling back to its corner, curling up and drinking the thick liquid with what could only be described as a melancholy stare. As he could step forward to grab their rations, Eri tugged at his tail gently and pointed at the human, a worried frown creasing her brow. Doesn't it need to eat too? She murmured, almost quietly. Isewa shifted on his feet. The human hadn't eaten at all since it had arrived, only partaking in the fluid bottles. It no longer seemed interested in their group, and any attempts that Isewa made to reconnect their minds was brushed aside. The human coiled itself up and turned its back to them, a clear sign of it being done with whatever sort of communing was being done earlier. Humans were taking their first major steps into space exploration. Centuries after their first steps on the moons and the subsequent planets, the technology has been analyzed and patched up to allow humans to go further. Space was the unexplored frontier, with much of its information and secrets hidden from the general public. In fact, most never knew that they'd already had alien contact. How else would human technology be as advanced as it was? After all, it was stolen tech from a previous attempted invasion that had been an utter failure on the aliens' part. It was clear that the aliens that attempted to attack had not expected the humans to be almost entirely immune to their communing. Those that fell under the influence of the commune were swiftly disposed of, their corpses to be experimented on. It was just so fascinating, and no one ever questioned why there was never any other attempt to communicate with aliens. That's because Earth was completely off limits, ported off my laws and regulations that makes it a crime to go anywhere near the planet. The Galactic Federation made any and all travel within the 317, the portion of the galaxy that houses the species, punishable by death. But now humans were more invested in space, tearing apart controls and learning the mechanisms in those ships from decades prior. It wasn't long before humans slowly pushed past their planet. Midoriya Izuku adored his stepfather. After his mother divorced, she had lost any hope of finding another person. Somehow, against all odds, Yagi found them. Izuku never knew why the most famous astronaut would want to settle down with them. They were poor, had nothing to offer or give, and held no sort of social standing. Others could give him so much more, but still, he chose the Midoriyas. To everyone, Yagi Tashinori, All Might, was a symbol of what humans can accomplish. He was a pillar of strength as he pushed past any limit set and achieved the unthinkable. To Midoriya Izuku, Yagi Tashinori was so much more. He was his father, his mentor, his friend. After Inko died, Yagi took a leave of absence to mourn and raise Izuku. They had lost her, but at the very least they still had each other. Izuku. Yagi's voice was grave as he sat himself at the table. I think you're ready. Izuku's head shot up and the tamagoyaki that he'd brought up to his mouth flopped back into his dish. MMFF. His cheeks were puffed and his mouth full of food, but that didn't stop Izuku from trying to speak. He only stopped when Yagi laughed and told him to swallow first. When he went to swallow, though, it almost immediately came back up, and it took all of his power not to throw his head to the side and vomit it all out. This wasn't his breakfast with Yagi or dinner with Mom. They were gone, and this was rotted and tasted like sulfur on his tongue. As Isuku struggled to keep the meal down, the other alien life form in the cell, the one that kept shoving the food towards him, made a happy sound. It was like a deep-throated purr that especially pleased cats make when you pet them just right. The sound soothed him and made it just a bit easier to choke down whatever that gruel was. It smelled and tasted like blood. The blood that came out of Yaga's throat as he lay dying. Izuku hadn't noticed that he got closer to the alien. If he had, he would have saw how it leaned back and looked uncertain, and how its purrs petered out. He didn't notice any of that. Instead, he brought forth the memory of the sound, just cats purring, and mimicked it. Isewa was just using a technique he uses for all of his students. The rumbling purr that his kind can make are notoriously soothing and makes for a good reward. So he'd done it when the human ate some of the gray-colored gruel and barely swallowed it down. He just wasn't expecting the sound to catch its attention as much as it did. The human had perked up immediately and swallowed down the food, despite struggling to do so moments before, and trotted closer to the partis. They were only a few inches apart, and Isewa couldn't stop his fur from prickling as his deep rumbling purr stopped. Sue him, he was nervous being this close to a human. He was shocked to hear an echoing rumble erupt from the human, almost exactly the same sound that he himself made not a minute before. It was a little off, the pitch a bit wrong and a bit too warbling at times, but it was an imitation that Isewa never heard from any other race before. Somehow this human was able to almost perfectly mimic the rumbling communication of the partis. Isewa couldn't hide the shudder that went through him. The ability to mimic was rare, so finding out that humans can make noises like other species, familiar enough to track anyone who'd never heard the call of an original partis, would no doubt fall for this almost perfect mimicry. At least the human was eating. He purred and rumbled for every bite taken, but growled and snarled for every bite refused. Each snarl was backed by Katsuki's automatic response hiss. Anytime the teen hears a sound even remotely aggressive, he responds in kind. The three sentients jerked back in surprise when, almost out of nowhere, the human hissed back, its flat teeth shining in the dim light as it made the sound. It can make perfect sounds, why doesn't it just speak? Katsuki pointed a clawed finger to the seated human, who, in their lapse of attention, had gotten bored and wandered off. Iri was beside it. It was currently playing with the soft hair that would soon become a mane that any Pulvis would be proud to have. The human was threading gentle fingers and warbling wordless noises. It was almost soothing. It was placid and accepted all the pokes and prods from the youngest sentient. Katsuki had gotten sick of Iri's touches within a cycle, yet the human was patient and made no aggressive noises or movements towards the youngest. Little was known of human tendencies, but his eyes will watch the human gently wrestle with Iri. He could only wonder just what were humans. So little was known about them, and it was showing in the way the traffickers had handled their human cargo. Their first and biggest mistake was placing it with other sentients. Humans were solitary. Humans are pack animals that will fight fiercely to protect its pack. They are not solitary creatures. The human housed with them was an anomaly. It was small and looked like an herbivorous species like the Pulvis, yet it attacked when the guards agitated it. The human had no reason to help them, but it did, and now sported a multitude of wounds that were barely hidden by the baggy clothes on its form. Do you think it has a name? Iri's eyes were wide from where she now sat next to Isewa. At some point the human had gently pushed her towards the partis and trinitrox pair before shuffling back to its proclaimed corner and curling itself up. It hadn't moved since it went back. Its eyes were closed and its breaths were deep and even, hinting at it possibly going through its resting phase. I'm not sure, Iri. Perhaps one can find out when it wakes up. The youngest in their cage stared at the human and nodded. For the first time in the cycles they had been trapped there, Iri's eyes shone with something other than helplessness. This human had somehow brought some sort of spark back into the girl. Katsuki, Isewa felt his student shuffle to stand beside him. Do you think you can make these into something more suitable? He uncovered the stolen contraband, 2 of their batons and a few pieces of loose armor. To CH, Katsuki snatched the 2 batons. It's almost an insult for you to ask that. I'll work on it. Isewa nodded before angling himself to block Katsuki from view to those who passed their cage. If anyone were to pass the cage, that is. Most guards were creeping around it and avoiding the section like the plague. No doubt word had gotten around about the vicious human. Another cycle passed before their cell door was soon opened once more. This time there was a larger group of guards. 6 this time, and one of them was larger than all the others seen before. With 6 arms instead of 4 and a pair of chitinous wings folded along its back, it was intimidating. The small pin on its breast signifying it as a commander. This thing give you trouble? Its mandibles clacked alongside its slurred basic as the commander peered down at the human, which had yet to move from its corner. It's smaller than the more dangerous trinitrox in here. It was vicious, Commander. I swear it tore his arm right off. It wasn't the trinitrox. Isewa's eyes narrowed in on the sixth guard. He could fuzzily remember it being the one to drag the other two injured from their cell and flee with them and the other personnel that had joined them. Apparently they hadn't learned their lesson. Grab the pulvis, we need for testing. The commander threw out a hand for the other two guards to grab Eri. Before they could enter though, the human snarled. Lips once more pulled in a way to show off blunt teeth. Isewa knew that those teeth could easily sever an arm. But the commander clearly didn't, for they barked out a laugh, not intimidated in the least, and pulled a slimmer baton from their waist. A thin whip made of flimsy, yet highly conductive metal that was interwoven around sharp thorns that would dig and tear out flesh. It was common on illegal shipment vessels such as these, but Isewa had yet to see one in person. The human didn't seem to care about the new weapon. It hissed, a sound that was almost identical to Katsuki's warning hisses, and lunged forward. The commander wasn't worried, for they brought the whip down and managed to get a glancing blow on the human's arm. The amount of electricity that had to have shot through the system of the human must have been immense, except the human only seized up for a split second before continuing in its frontal assault. Ignoring the now frantic thrashes of the whip as it got closer, Isewa saw it pull something from its thin coat, a shard of a broken fluid bottle, and plunged it into the commander's arm. It had to back off when the whip hit it point blank along its front. Thick red welled to the surface, and with a slight inhale, Isewa knew why the human was so reluctant to eat the food. The food they were provided smelled the exact same as the blood that was welling to the surface. Katsuki, he felt rather than heard his student grumble in affirmation. This was their chance. It was perfect. All they had to do was take down the commander and get out before backup can arrive. Isewa hissed as the whip cracked closer to him and his charges. He had spaced out, and in that time the commander began to swing the weapon out further and further, getting closer to striking one of the other three sentients huddled in the corner. One particularly close strike had Eri crying out. The human's eyes snapped to the pulvis and immediately back to the commander, the sneer on its lips pulling even further, far enough that the glint of sharper teeth could barely be seen. It was less careful of the hits. Instead of wasting energy dodging the frantic swings, the human allowed them to make contact. At one point it even allowed the whip to wrap around its forearm in an attempt to wrench the weapon from the commander's grasp. A smart plan if it weren't for the commander gripping the weapon with its other two limbs. The human noticed that, and it didn't take long for it to create a new plan. Isewa covered Eri's ears and eyes as the human went feral, teeth reflecting the electricity that was arcing around the room as they buried into the chitin armor of the commander. It was able to tear the plates off with ease, barely having to wrench its head before the plate was peeled off with a wet squelch followed by a screech from the commander. Isewa and Katsuki got involved when the other guards began to enter the cage. With a snarl, he was able to slit the throat of one while Katsuki snapped the spine of the other. The human was still ripping the flesh off the commander, and the last two guards were hesitant to enter the cage. It was a clear death sentence if they attempted to assist their commander. Leave us, or else I'll set the human on you. Isewa's eyes glowed red as he snarled at the remaining two guards. They nodded and babbled uselessly, but were ultimately silenced when Katsuki shoved them into their former cell and locked it behind them. The human was covered in bits of flesh and yellow blood, but its eyes were bright with curiosity as it trotted alongside them, its feet making an echoing clack 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 that made Isewa's fur rise. He was nervous, and any sound was a detriment. It seemed the human agreed because it stopped and crouched down. What useless thing is it doing now? Katsuki threw his hands into the air in exasperation as Eri attempted to get the human to follow them. After a few moments it stood back up and trotted back to the other two sentients, Eri beside it. This time it walked without any sound. Somehow it removed all noise it made while moving. Isewa mentally noted that humans were good at stealth as well. Lovely. Their escape to the docking bay was tense, with every sound putting Isewa on edge, and on some cases he had the urge to grab the human and not let it go, especially after it attacked two guards that blocked their way. Instead of hiding like the other three sentients, the human walked up and smashed its fist into the first guard's face, then snapped the other one's neck with a well-rounded kick. It had the audacity to gesture for them to follow it. Its lips quirked upwards and eyes closed in pride. Katsuki cursed in his native tongue as he stepped past the human. His scales were darker, showing that he was shocked by the human's actions. Despite that small hiccup, they were able to make it and secure a ship. It was a tense amount of time that they waited as Katsuki began to fiddle with the multiple securities that keep the smaller ships from being accessed by anyone but the pilot. Somehow they did it. Somehow they escaped from Overhaul's notorious frigate with two more than when they were captured. Somehow in the process, they had purposefully yet accidentally acquired a human. How was Isewa supposed to explain this to Yamda? It's not a tool, my boy, it's a living thinking being. Yagi ran a large hand through Izuku's curls. The two had gotten closer after Inko's death, their shared secret making them almost inseparable. I just don't know why it's acting like this. Izuku sniffled weakly. You said it worked with you immediately. I've yet to feel anything. It had been nearly a year since Yagi had given Izuku the sentience that had sat in the corner of his mind for decades. It was weird, its humming was faint, as though it were blocked by a wall. Yagi was just barely able to hear the wordless whispers as the sentience puttered around their newest host. They could still commune with one another, connecting in a way that allowed Izuku to flourish even more. The boy had grown since Yagi became his father. "It's time, my boy." A large hand cupped Izuku's cheek, and a snort was heard when Izuku tried to snuggle deeper into the warmth he found himself encased in. The soft hand began to feel rough and was soon jostling him. The voice, once belonging to Yagi, now carried no words and instead was just incomprehensible babble interspersed with snarls and growls. Izuku blearily opened his eyes and swatted at the claw that was prodding his cheek. He would normally be more careful around these creatures, but he was too tired at the moment. His sentience hummed in the back of his mind, a soft weaving melody that carried memories and stories long lost to history. It was enough to soothe him back into a dream-filled slumber. "Gruh, useless human has only been sleeping." Katsuki threw his hands up with a snarl. He'd been trying to wake the human up for questioning. It clearly wasn't working. Since they had gotten in the ship, the human was slower and Katsuki could see the way it held itself. It was tired, and that was proven when the human curled up on one of the many seats and closed its eyes. Its breaths were deep and even and on occasion it would twitch and burble. It was almost cute in a disgusting sort of way. Any luck? Isewa was taking care of comms and keeping their pathetic vessel on course to intersect with one of UAS major vessels. "No, it's still sleeping." He scuffed his foot in agitation. The human was an unknown and he hated not knowing things. It was dangerous to be uniformed with situations such as these. He couldn't relax until he knew that the human was not a threat to his pack. Yamada huffed at the control panel in front of him. He had been piloting this unit for well over 7 cycles, and his eyes were blurring the many keys in front of him. It was grueling, but he had to do it. It was his mate that was endangered. No one else could track down Isewa as well as Yamada could. "Sir," Shinso had shifted from his seat. "I think we might have located their tracks." He pointed at the trail of space debris. They were arranged in a somewhat linear path. Such a trail was a sign that a ship had disturbed the peaceful waves of space and left behind its own trail in the process. "Are we close enough to attempt contact?" He didn't turn towards his spawn, focusing on the panels as he adjusted their trajectory to place them directly over the trail of debris left behind by what is hopefully his mate's current ship. After asking, he heard Shinso grunt and slump back into his chair. That was the answer. Clearly they were close enough. Now he just had to wait for Shinso. Shinso reached out tentatively. His own mind but a whisper of a thread tapping gently and requesting entrance. Entrance that was soon granted, and with it came a sensory overload. It always caught him off guard when transferring his conscious, no matter how many times he'd done it before. "Papa." It was a mental nudge, testing the waters of Isewa's mental state. "Shinso, safe?" Isewa's mental voice was a deep timbre that shook when he responded, heavy emotion flowing through their connection, strengthening as the two ships got steadily closer and closer to one another. Shinso was a mixed species. With both Pardus and Kyuhoku's genes, it gave him a unique variety of abilities. With their own setbacks, of course, but the biggest boon was Shinso's ability to commune and implant himself into another as long as he is close enough to do so. Known as a Parco, his talents led to him being accepted as an intelligence agent in training. En route with Pops, Isewa got the impression of looking at Yamda through Shinso vision, a technique they do often and that comes in clutch for cases like this. "Switch?" It was a weak question. Isewa gave the affirmative before he remembered, but it had already been done. Shinso had swapped their consciousness, and by the time he jolted up to remind his spawn, he was already out of control and there was no way to regain control until Shinso hit his limit, WAD forcefully expelled, or released willingly. "Fuck." Bruh. Isewa ran a clawed paw down his, Shinso's face. "Shayuda." Yamda detached himself from the control panel and swept the Parco into his embrace. Isewa returned the gesture before detaching himself and shuffling towards the control panel. "How close are we?" His face was turned into a frown as he attempted to gauge their distance. He had forgotten about the human on their ship and allowed his spawn to take over his body without alerting him. "Fuck." Shinso felt a shiver run down his entire body as his consciousness settled within the Pardus brain. He felt a brief flash of panic come from his papa but hadn't thought much of it. "Oi," Katsuki snarled and grabbed Isewa's body by the collar of his suit. "The fuck are you doing here, brain freak?" He shook Shinso to accentuate his point. "Yamda and I are en route to pick you two up and return to our base. So you can't count either, huh?" Katsuki's palms began to spark before he snuffed them out and gestured to the back of the ship. There were 2 more sentients. "Fuck. Are they hostile?" Shinso was immediately on guard. Though he was unused to fighting while his consciousness is in another body, he would do his best. "No, you dumbass." Katsuki shoved Shinso back, keeping the other away from the other occupants of the ship. They escaped with us. I thought Isewa briefed you before letting you work your way into here. Shinso went to respond before Green shot towards him. All he could comprehend was Katsuki's hiss, surprise, and heavy panting. Toxic Green stared back at him. A human. He felt a chill go down his spine. He was currently pinned by a human. Oi, oi, oi. Get off of him, you stupid Dekanabu. Katsuki made to pull the human off of Shinso, but stopped when the sentient snarled at him. A derisive noise that, though wordless to Shinso, was clear to Katsuki. Back off, was what that sound meant to the trainees. Why aren't you doing anything? He hissed to the other, but Katsuki had backed away. Clearly no help now. Shinso coughed in surprise as something began to violently root through his brain. Somehow it surpassed Isewa's memories and dug itself into his own consciousness. Ares, he. The voice was laced with rage, and the way the human dug through his memories showed that it believed Shinso to be a threat. We are commuting. He is in my body aboard another ship coming to dock with this one. As he spoke, it somehow became harder and harder to mentally project his thoughts, causing his speech to be rushed and garbled. Its eyes glared down at Shinso suspiciously, though he barely managed to gasp out, "Not enemy." He saw Katsuki stiffen from the edge of his vision before the trainees moved forward. "Not an enemy, you idiot," the other huffed. "He's just an extra." The human still glared at Shinso suspiciously, but backed off, allowing the other much-needed space and air to breathe. "What the fuck? Looks like Daddy didn't warn you." Katsuki's smile was all fangs. "We got a human aboard." Clearly, Shinso gasped as he tried to calm his racing heart. The human had backed away, returning to its claimed spot and tucked itself back, no doubt to scare the living shit out of the next sentient that tries to threaten anyone aboard. Not counting Shinso, of course. He grimaced as the young Pulvis trotted back up to the human and demanded to be allowed to settle on its lap. "Is that safe?" He pointed to the odd scene, and Katsuki only snorted. "It's fine. Uri somehow tamed the damn thing. I can see. You're lucky it didn't tear out your I guess Isewa's throat." Katsuki grunted. Shinso didn't bother stifling his snort. "It looks like a weaker sentient. I don't think it can go against a Pardus." Katsuki only barked out a bout of laughter before he quieted. The noise caused the other two sentients to turn towards them. The human's toxic green eyes dug into Shinso's borrowed eyes and seemed to pick him apart. It made his fur crawl. He slammed the link between him and Isewa the moment the human bared its teeth at him and began to make a chick-gaha sound in its throat. Fuck that. He felt much more comfortable in his actual body if this thing got aggressive again. Isewa was having a nice conversation with his mate before he was slammed back into his own body. The change so jarring that he gagged on his tongue from the shock of it. "What the? Welcome back." Katsuki's voice rang from the rear of the ship. He was seated near the human and Uri and was allowing the two to poke him. Well, he let the human poke and prod him, which was shockingly tolerant of the trainees. "Why am I on the floor?" he regretted asking. It was better to not get the answers for whatever the fuck had occurred while he was in Shinso's body. Dekanabu sensed Shinso and pounced on him. "Nearly tore your throat out." Katsuki cackled. The scene was ruined when the human grabbed his head and jerked it around to peer into Katsuki's mouth, much to the garbled annoyance of the other. "What did you just call the human?" Katsuki scowled and pursed his lips. He decided to call him Dekanabu. Thank God for Eri, because he's useless and doesn't understand anything. And Isewa felt a headache beginning behind his lower eye set. Before he could reprimand her, the human chuffed a sound similar to a Pardus reprimanding call and garbled out something that sounded like no and very bad basic. Isewa closed his eyes and ran a paw down his face. He had no words for whatever this was. Honestly, he didn't care at the moment. He just wanted to dock with the main ship sent by UA and rest for at least 5 cycles in an actual bed. When he reopened his eyes and saw that the human had climbed upon Katsuki's back and was currently holding the trainees' horns, he let his head slam into the control panel. "You don't seem to understand. I am the one in contact with their primitive government, not you." He smoothed over his ruff of feathers. "You see, I had this amazing plan, following. Oi, don't ya try nothin'. Don't think we're unarmed." The small black puppet shot to life, causing a few of the other occupants to voice their surprise. It was a good intimidation technique. Make them believe that he's alone with only a small black puppet, when in truth there are 2 occupants, one hidden and one visible. "Mimic, try not to threaten our guests." Of course, Mimic settled down and allowed his boss to continue. This plan, as I'm sure you know, was to get a few humans as test subjects and we'd give them some of our technology. He steepled his talons together. "So why is it that you haven't delivered yet, Shigaraki?" Shigaraki scratched harder at his throat, dull fingernails peeling away barely healed scabs. "It's difficult to get prime test subjects." The man practically hissed. "It'd be easier if the government weren't attacking my men." "Ah, but they only offered me and my men a pass. Looks like you'll have to deal with it." Shigaraki growled and began tearing into his neck harder. "Whatever. Do say hello to your boss for me. After all, he's the holder of your strings, human." Overhaul laughed, Mimic joining in moments later with his own bark of laughter. Just be patient. They'll see, Shigaraki hissed to himself. He motioned his followers, and they framed around him as they exited the winding maze of one of Overhaul's slew of ships. They'll see soon. Yamda hadn't been sure what to expect when he docked with the small dinky little ship that his mate was in. He expected Katsuki probably shouting about something while Isewa looked like death incarnate. He did not expect to walk in and see a human shoving Katsuki's head around. His husband was ignoring this attack. Katsuki wasn't even attempting to fight back. Yamda didn't have time to stop Shinso from walking in. Oh god, it's even worse through my own eyes. The Parko leaned away from the sight. Shinso's voice was enough to get Katsuki's attention, and it was like a switch had been flipped. Where the trainees had once been passive and letting the human bat him around, now he had stood up and seemed to be trying to run towards them for freedom. Katsuki couldn't escape the human's grasp, which seemed unfairly strong. Don't. Isewa's voice stopped Yamda from opening his mouth to ready an attack. Why don't? Isewa, love of my life, star of my eye, there is a human attacking Katsuki and another sentient that might get hurt by it. He tried to explain. Oi, don't talk shit about Deku. That's my job. Katsuki's scales rattled and changed to a more aggressive color. Yeah, Deku is our shit. The smallest sentient pumped her fist. Oh god, you freaks have it trained. Shinso let himself slump onto Yamda while bemoaning something about tamed humans all the while. Okay, I'm missing something. He glared at his mate, who could have told him while he was communing with Shinso but for some reason chose not to. The human extracted itself from Katsuki and trotted towards Yamda. It took everything in the Kyuhoku's ability to not attack it. They were a threat that warranted a flea on sight notice. And here he was, letting one walk closer to him. It made odd burbling noises as it trotted near him. Its mouth was moving but no discernible words were made. Instead it was just making senseless noises, and he couldn't deny that it was sort of cute. We escaped with a human. Isewa piped up as the human circled Yamda. He was housed with us and helped us escape. The other paused before he tacked on. He listens to Iri and likes to wrestle with Katsuki. Great. Glad to know the human has hobbies. Yamda hissed towards his mate. He wasn't expecting the human to hiss back, displaying its small teeth in some sort of threat. Inoro. It gurgled. Behaha. Katsuki clapped his hands together as he laughed. Deku talking back. I trained him so well. Katsuki grinned widely. Shinso moaned from his place, slumped over Yamda, and at the noise the human perked up. Once its focus was off of him, he shot a dirty look towards Isewa. I've done nothing to deserve this, Shinso groused. It was his turn to be observed by the human. It trotted around him and burbled quietly. Occasionally it prodded at him but danced out of range of any aggressive moves that Shinso might have made. When there were none, the human moved back and continued its prodding, burbling the entire time. What's with the noises? He does that a lot. Iri and Katsuki. Oi, think it's cute. I can't help but agree with them. Isewa gestured towards Katsuki, and the trainees huffed before spitting a short tongue of flame. Oi, Deku, get over here. Let the adults talk boring. But bring Shinso. The human perked up at Katsuki's voice but didn't move until the other had finished talking. It looked between Yamda and Isewa before it gurgled a few times, then proceeded to bodily grab Shinso and throw the Parko over its shoulder. What the? He does that? Was all Isewa said. The two began to speak at length over the plans and routes to take to return to the rest of their troop. It was often hard to focus with Shinso and Katsuki arguing, thankfully Iri and the human weren't loud in whatever they were doing. When Yamda looked back to check, he saw the human with its eyes closed and the partis sitting on his lap. What about the human? Isewa grimaced and ran a paw down his face. We're keeping him. At this point in time, we don't know what circumstances led to him being here, but he clearly has imprinted on us. Apparently he thinks of us as some sort of pack. Yamda clicked his beak at the idea. Is he a threat? Yes, he squawked at his mate's immediate answer. He's a threat to anyone but us, and whoever we say isn't a threat. You'll be fine. If you say so. They began to move all possible belongings or valuables from their stolen escape pod to the main quarters of the UA ship. Katsuki and Shinso were employed to assist with the work while Iri and the human were able to sleep. When Yamda went into rest, toxic green eyes plagued his dreams. Isuku trotted behind the newest arrivals. They were all talking in their own language, which was just fascinating because they were all clearly different species, yet they could all speak the same language despite also having their own sub-language. What he wouldn't give to have one of his notebooks. A tug on his suit brought him from his musings, and he smiled when he saw the youngest of the group. He absolutely adored Iri, which took an interesting game of charades to find out her name, but it was worth it. He would kill for her. What is it, Iri? Izuku tousled her hair and smiled when she pouted up at him. She raised her arms in the universal sign of wanting to be picked up. And who was Isuku to deny her that? He carried her around until he was shown the living quarters for the ship. The other reptilian alien had stomped off after growling something to Isuku and Iri. Iri had apparently wanted to room with him because they were given a chamber that had 2 beds in them. Izuku didn't mind the least. She was the first one to approach him and she was also just super cute. Sue him, she was adorable. She'd fallen asleep the moment she curled up in her bed. However, Izuku was not offered that sort of luxury. When his head hit the soft pillow equivalents, his mind began to buzz. They swirled in his mind like restless animals. I don't know how to, you guys always start it. Izuku could feel the annoyance bubbling from the others and he mentally chided them. I'm human, not whatever you were, clearly don't have the knowledge. Their voices quieted before one took charge. Her voice was smoother than the others and resonated clearly. She had been the one to learn the languages to speak to Yagi, thus had the best understanding of them. Who am I communing with now? They murmured in his ears. Izuku heaved a sigh before going to hunt down the room that he'd seen Isewa go into. The feline-looking alien had to know where the avian one was if they weren't in the same room already. So what is the importance of this? All merely hummed in the back of his mind, offering no answer, which wasn't unusual. They were odd on the best of days and downright unintelligible on the worst. They'd also been pushing more since his abrupt capture. He could feel them slowly weaving throughout his body at times, offering him their abilities. But aside from that, Izuku couldn't say what all chose to do. They hummed through his veins when he needed them most and offered him company in the most dire of times. Thanks to all, he still has his father with him. Yagi doesn't take the front seat often, but Izuku can feel his presence and that is more than enough for him. He stumbled through the hallways, listening to the slight nudges from all to lead him to where the avian one was. They murmured in his mind about him being the other one's mate, so they should be together. As Izuku passed the room of the other sentient, not the reptilian one, he felt all hiss slightly at their presence. They didn't like the idea of someone invading their host's mind. Too many secrets lay within Izuku's brain and none of them are meant to be shared. A creature that could pull them out, well, all was much more likely to teach them not to touch their vessel. Calm down. Izuku soothed the agitated sentients. They grumbled but slowly allowed themselves to quiet, soothing the scent of ozone from the air and the flickers of lightning from Izuku's form. And here, they swirled around happily and nudged Izuku to open the door, but that didn't stop Izuku. The doors whooshed open after a successful chirp and he padded into the room. All were nudging him closer and closer to their target until Izuku stood right beside the avian alien's head. All swirled through his bones and he felt them begin the connection. Yamda's eyes shot open and he nearly shrieked at the sight of two luminous eyes staring at him. Almost a few tail feathers away from him stood the human. He felt his beak begin to open in a supersonic shout before a hand shot forward and clamped his mouth shut. He choked for a second as the air was redirected. Hisashi felt himself begin to panic more. This whole situation was not good for his health. Its mental voice carried an echo that hurt his head if he tried to focus too hard on it. It resonated and shook like the vibrations of out-of-tune notes. It made his body hurt at the thought. He glared at the human that still had their little paws wrapped around his beak. The human moved its eyes in a disgusting movement. It made him even more nauseous. We're returning to dock with the primary ship under Commander Nedzuto. Hisashi ignored the plural and instead allowed his neck feathers to fluff in annoyance. You're returning with us, not giving you to those that captured you. Finally, his beak was freed and the human stepped away. It bobbed its head in an odd motion before raising and shaking its hand at him as it turned and left. Hisashi swears that he heard a rumbling purr coming from its throat. I hate you. Isewa snickered. Katsuki glared around the table. They were due to dock with the Yui vessel. However, instead of helping with that, he was stuck with Brain Freak, the Pulvis, and the damned human. This fucking blows. He let out a few bursts of pops from his palms in agitation. No, the human smacked him on the shoulder and bared its teeth at him. A challenge. The fuck? No, the human smacked him again. This time he narrowed his eyes. No, he repeated. Katsuki was too befuddled to come up with any sort of other reaction. All he could do was stare wide-eyed at the human that was reprimanding him for some reason. What the fuck? The human pointed towards Iri. No, they hissed and finally Katsuki caught on. He was being told not to swear in front of the fucking Pulvis. Look at you. Big bad Katsuki bowing to the whims of a human. Shinso snickered from his end of the table. Never thought I'd see the day. No, the human walked up to Shinso and bitch slapped him, leveling the parko with the same disappointed stare. When Isewa returned, he got to see the human watching his two pupils like a roger. Eri was playing with pigments, completely ignorant of the tense air surrounding her. We've permission. Katsuki shot up immediately and hurried past Isewa, Shinso following moments after. The human and Eri were slower in their movements, mainly because the human had no clue what was going on. Eri was pulling it, playing interpreter it seemed. You'll be safe here. He placed a paw on both of their heads and ruffled Eri's mane and the human's odd mane of emerald fur. I promise. The human smiled up at him, showing startlingly white teeth. Thank you. It garbled in awkward common. He had to duck his head into the line of white around his neck to hide his own pleased grin. It did little to muffle to purring that could be heard though. I want him dead, sensei. He paced around the cockpit while the others did whatever behind him. He didn't care what those useless extras did as long as they were useful. He is important for now. Once his use is run dry, then you can do whatever you please to him and those who follow him. The deep timbre on the other side of the static knew just what to say to please Shigaraki and keep him as stable as possible. A lipless mouth grinned as it listened to the next rant of Shigaraki's begin. Izuku, you know I am not like everyone else. A heavy hand ran through viridian-colored curls. Yagi took a moment to collect himself. I've been here for a long time, he began. You know that I've been with them for a long time. Them being the other being that resided within his skull. I think, he took a deep shuddering breath, I think it's time I've passed it to you. Izuku's entire body tensed and any drowsiness that the boy had felt previously was washed away by a flood of panic and fear. This was the talk he'd never want to experience. No, not like that, Toshinori soothed, running his hand through green strands once more. I will pass them along, but a small piece of them will reside in me. I promise. Neither mentioned the tears running down his cheeks. I will not die without them. Izuku whimpered faintly and smooshed his face closer to Toshinori's chest. The sound of his stepfather's steady heartbeat was enough to soothe the anxious teen. Although he'd lost his mom years ago, he couldn't bear the thought of being alone. He couldn't bear having his dad leave him too. Nedzu stared at the newcomers from his perch on Power Loader's shoulders. As expected, Yamda was at the head of their little formation while Shinso and Isewa lagged behind. The Parko was no doubt pushing Katsuki's buttons with how violently the Trinitrox was reacting. Isewa, however, was walking side by side with one of the most dangerous known sentients, a human. And to make things all the more interesting, the human held a pulvis in its arms, both rare and desired sentients and both victims of the illegal trade. Once he finished checking over his workers, Nedzu turned his full attention on the human as their group moved closer to the meat point. His first impression of it was vastly underwhelming. It was thin and lanky with an odd way of movement. Its arms seemed too long and its body not proportional. As far as he could see, this human held no form of defense or offensive capabilities. It looked even weaker than the young pulvis within its arms. All thoughts halted when vibrant green eyes met his own and Nedzu felt himself stiffen. The eyes seemed to peer into his very being and dig into his soul. Its eyes narrowed and it bared flat teeth at the headmaster. Seconds later he felt it force its way into his mind, shoving through any possible barriers that might have hindered it. The human didn't pause in its movements as it both walked closer and simultaneously ripped through his mind with ease. We are, not yo, ers to, stew, die. His eyes widened when he heard the garbled voice communing with him. The human's toxic gaze focused on his own. Nedzu felt the urge to find out more, an enigma, and he desired to unravel it. Nedzu, Isewa came up and placed a paw on the human's top fur, ruffling it gently. Permission to take him to Heights Dock Station 1A. Nedzu squinted at the pair, his mind connecting and weaving through ploys and plots before eventually landing on something. Power. Having a human aboard the Yui station would give him power equal to the commission in this case. After all, it may be illegal to poach humans, but if a human were to join of its own volition, that's a whole other story. Permission granted. Isewa only spared him a curt nod before turning and walking back to Yamda's ship. As he walked away, he relayed the commands to the two students. The human stared at Nedzu longer than appropriate, and he felt his fur begin to prickle. Its eyes seemed to flicker with storms from the most violent of planets with striking light and roars of the skies. It turned and left, leaving an unsettled Nedzu behind. Izuku claimed his spot at the table in the large ship. For some reason they'd gotten out only to return after speaking to some comically large rat. But hey, he couldn't judge, so whatever. It wasn't long before the other aliens seated themselves around the table with him. Izuku tolerated their staring before he eventually got sick of it and jolted in his seat. He stood up and pointed to himself. Isewa was studying the human and nearly fell out of his seat when it stood so abruptly. It didn't seem to notice that it scared the other occupants, Sanzuri, and began to point at itself, repeating the same muddled sounds. It sounded like it was growling, followed by some sort of warble before ending with a click sound. After a few attempts, Isewa realized what the human was doing. It was so similar to when Eri had told it her own name. He tried to mimic the sounds. Isuku. It felt like he was choking as he tried to say it. The human shook its head and repeated its name again, hitting the table with its small paws as though that would help the others pronounce its name easier. Gruh. Katsuki had clearly lost his patience. Just call it Dekanabu. Izuku. Eri slammed her hands down, similar to the human's movements before. The human frowned for a moment before it lifted its shoulders and nodding at her, doing the weird thing where it shows its teeth. Unthreateningly. Izuku. Isewa tried. The human Isuku chuffed in agreement. So that's its name. Shinso didn't lift his head from the table. It must be what it goes by. Isewa squinted. At least we can call it something other than human. He groused. While Isewa was speaking to his spawn, somehow over their heads, Isuku was now yelling garbled noises at Katsuki while Eri egged them on. It was a meaningless argument, one half in some language that Isewa did not understand a lick of. and the other just insults that got progressively more and more vulgar as Katsuki attempted to win whatever this was. At least Yamda was in the cockpit and he didn't have to worry about his mate joining just to add more noise to whatever was happening. He couldn't wait to be back in his own bed, where his students could not get to him, or where the human could walk in and scare his mate and nearly deafen him. Following the showing of UA's newest hero trainees were countless applications for apprenticeships, multiple big-named agents putting in forms to train the students of UA. Some had been requested specifically whilst others had to be assigned their mentors. Katsuki was one of those who was offered a chance to train beneath one of the top hero agents, only to get kidnapped alongside his teacher. While he was imprisoned for who knows how many cycles, his peers were out there getting stronger. They'd be taught by other fully fledged agents, and what was he doing? He was busy attempting to communicate with a human that was now a part of their squad, if Isewa's expression said anything about it. Some are still out on their apprenticeships. However, Todoroki and Ida are at the station after engaging in an altercation with criminal serial killer Stein. Shinso was rolling a piece of metal between his paws as he spoke. Katsuki felt his claws crackle with annoyance. He'd been hoping for one of his formation members to have been at the dorms, not for those other freaks. That meant that Kirishima and Kaminari were still with their mentors. Katsuki felt his entire body stiffen. The human hadn't been able to pronounce his name, and instead of trying, it had taken to calling him some nasty amalgamation of his name with whatever human language it used. He hated it. He hated it more because he was actually beginning to respond to that shitty name. Gift. Dekanabu had taken to giving Katsuki small things after he noted that the trinitrox got flustered by it. For whatever reason, the human liked to play with fire. Literally, Katsuki doesn't understand why Dekanabu would get so close to the igniting substance that coated his scales. Though it only would ignite along his palms and fingers, most species stayed away from a trinitrox's explosive gel. After depositing the gift in Katsuki's half-formed fist, Dekanabu thrust a palm forward and grabbed a handful of the explosive gel and ran. Oi, what the fuck? Shinso snorted from his spot at the table. That thing is fucking insane. How'd you guys get it again? We didn't get it. If anything, it got us. Katsuki groused. He looked at the small gift in his palms. It was a 2D holographic display on a thin substance. When he ran his claw over it, the image smudged and the substance seemed to fold in on itself. He'd stopped focusing on the fact that Deku had swiped some of the explosive gel and ran off with it. Wazet. Shinso was still attempting to become one with the table, though his tail flicked a bit, betraying his interest. I don't know. He stared at it. Katsuki couldn't bring himself to destroy it. All thoughts were cut off when an ear-shattering bang erupted through the ship. What was that? Isewa came scrambling into the room, his secondary eyes glowing as he prepared to nullify the threat. Except he only saw Katsuki and Shinso. Yamda was piloting. He was missing Eri and Izuku. Katsuki. What? The trinitrox growled. Was that you? Does it look like it was me? Wasn't him. The human did grab a glob of whatever coats him though, ran off right after too. Shinso added from his spot. You didn't think to stop him? Isewa snarled between grit teeth. I dunno. He glared at his spawn before whirling around to try to locate the origin of the explosion. It wasn't too far away from where Shinso and Katsuki were. It was just down the hall. Izuku was fiddling with the explosive substance. He'd yet to hear Isewa's entrance. To avoid startling the human, he scuffed his footwear on the floor. It startled Izuku. The other twisted around at blinding speed and flung a glob of viscous fluid directly at Isewa. Right behind the glob of fluid was a black stone. The fluid landed around his feet and the black stone followed moments later. It hit the ground with a soft skink and seemed to make a small spark. Not dissimilar to the ones Katsuki produces. Wait. Isewa barely scrambled back in time to avoid the worst of the ensuing blast. Somehow this freak of a problem child managed to mimic Katsuki's species' greatest weapon. This human can create explosives. Isewa was seated beside Yamda, fiddling with controls as his mate piloted the starship. The two remained in comfortable silence before it was broken with a sigh. I'm going to call them back, Isewa said, as he stood and padded to the attached comm unit not much further away from his previous seat. Are you sure? Yamda clicked his beak but didn't take his focus off the screen before him. They're at their first ever internships, is it wise? The other had a point. The first internship is always the most important, the one that molds them the most. Something churned in Isewa's gut. He had to call his students back. Wise or not, it's best that this happens sooner than later. I don't want to explain the situation more than once. He tapped on the screen and prepared to inform the first team. His students were undergoing their own learning opportunities, no doubt put on their internships after his and Katsuki's capture as a show of strength. But Isewa was more worried about getting them all back to their station so that all could be present when he explained their newest member. Not to mention the way his fur prickled at the thought of them not within reach. None of them have seen a human. Hell, even he hadn't seen one before this. So, it was of the highest priority to make sure that his students were made aware of the human and how it might interact and react to them. As the comm unit rang, Isewa allowed himself to sag in his chair as he waited for the first team to answer. Izuku felt them humming in the back of his mind. His head hurt and colors blinked in and out of sight. They hummed. Izuku allowed the vision to take him completely. He was seated within a room, people seated beside him, and a multitude of armed guards posted every few feet. The longer Izuku was in the body, the more senses slowly came to him. The rush of sounds would have made him flinch if it weren't for the fact that this body did not move. He was shackled to only what they had seen and felt at the time. It hurt his head to think about. The words were unintelligible to Izuku. They weren't speaking Japanese, and as he looked closer, he noted that the majority of people weren't even Japanese. Their voice had softened, and Izuku could hear Yaga's voice the most. Before, it was often Nana's voice that took the lead. To hear his late father again made tears well up. Izuku wiped them away before they could fall. Another voice took the lead, hissing the command and snapping Izuku out of his emotional haze. The scene became clearer as Izuku watched. He was in a courtroom. The defendant and prosecutor were both Japanese, yet they weren't in a Japanese court. Yaga's voice was a mere whisper. Izuku could feel him place his hand on his shoulder. The man in question was heavily chained, with 2 armed guards directly behind his chair and chains encircling his abdomen and attached to his cuffs. It was apparent that whatever this man did, it made him a threat. Izuku watched as the man thrashed in his binds. What happened to him? Yaga's voice was grim. Why did you show me this? As the vision faded away, Izuku could feel all moving throughout him. They whispered. Before Izuku could ask what they meant, he saw the faint outline of Yagi. The man kneeled before him and tousled his hair. Izuku felt his eyes well up with tears. I accept. I will protect you. All hummed, and it felt like all the previous holders were embracing him. It was clear that they believed in him, and Izuku wouldn't let anything happen to them while he was still breathing. All swirled a bit before taking on a deeper tone as Daigoro took charge of them. All seemed to grumble in response to Daigoro. Yaga's voice echoed through the ensuing silence. Oi Deku, the fuck are you doing? A heavy hand knocked Izuku from his dreamlike state. At the time when they were supposed to reveal something major, Izuku snarled at the one who woke him. His teeth were bared and his eyes bloodshot. Kaken's ruby eyes glared back at him. You shit. Izuku garbled in their language. Isewa thought he would have to restrain Katsuki with how violently the Trinitroques responded to the childish insult. To his relief, the others snarled and stomped away from their passenger. Izuku shoved past the 2 bickering aliens, ignoring their calls of his name in their supposed language. He was irritated. It was all within grasp, only to be pulled away as he reached for it. He had to go somewhere to cool off. Their voices were a soothing balm on the red-hot irritation that coursed through Izuku's vein. Their voices were no longer separate from one another. They were a singular unit, an individual that pushed and guided Izuku to where he needed to be. Izuku followed the tug. Not a step was wasted as he allowed them to guide him. They grew louder and began to move more within the pocket of his mind. Izuku could feel all flooding his veins and beginning to hum and wiggle in excitement. Their joy was enough to make him forget his own irritation from mere minutes before. What is it? He tried to ask. All didn't answer. Their movements growing stronger and the pull becoming more of a drag. They were moving him, and Izuku should be more concerned about that fact, but he felt himself influenced by their own emotion. The lights turned on the moment movement was detected, and Izuku's mind seemed to explode in light as all overtook him and moved him to one secluded section. They were within the hangar, somehow pulling Izuku to the location despite having no visual or mental map to go off of. They swirled within his mind and pushed him closer. It was a ship. A gaudy yellow with red stripe accents that was faded and chipping at the edges. It looked ugly compared to the ships surrounding Izuku. He didn't care to look at all the newer ships with the upgraded tech and mechanics. All sang for this ship. And he could feel it resonating with him, as though the ship was responding to all song. A ship. Izuku ran his hand over the faded colors and nearly leapt out of his skin when the metal rippled beneath his touch like water. What was that? All crowed happily. Their voices melded together until they were near indistinguishable from each other. If Izuku didn't know better, he wouldn't be able to tell that there were 7 different voices at the moment. It looks damaged. He circled the ship and noted the dents and tears within the hull. There were jagged gashes and smashed sections of the vehicle. It was a single voice that spoke up. The others of all were completely silent. It was jarring. One seemed to sigh. It doesn't look as advanced as the others. Izuku hesitated when voicing his thoughts to the first. But instead of being insulted, they barked out a laugh that resonated throughout his mind. Is it really that important? Izuku chanced another look at the gaudy ship but couldn't find any indication that it was advanced as first claimed it was. Izuku felt first gently nudge into control and run Izuku's hands over an undamaged section of the hull. Just like before, it rippled, except this time the metal seemed to curl in on itself before forming an entryway, just big enough for Isuku to fit into. First stepped into the doorway, and Isuku could only stare as the vehicle seemed to come to life. The vehicle seemed to pulse rhythmically beneath their feet. "Why is it here?" Isuku asked as First moved them around the ship. First spat and gestured to the damaged innards of the vehicle. "Did you ever name them?" Isuku was running his fingers over every available surface. First went quiet. A few heartbeats passed and First relinquished control, allowing Isuku to once more pilot his own body. They murmured not unkindly. The ship seemed to hum as Isuku explored it. A song resonated from within it, a song that only they could hear. It was as though this ship completed him. With it he felt whole, a piece of him he never knew was missing. It was him as much as he were it. All seemed to resonate and hum to an invisible tune. It was a winding harmony that matched with the melody of all. Together they made a song that spoke of countless adventures and strife that they've experienced. Izuku didn't want to leave the comforting bubble of the ship. Greater than safe return. Wait, guard will wait. Lesser than the harmony of the ship seemed to wind through Izuku's mind. He would return. He felt the thrill of joy emanate from the ship when all sang about their plan to return for it. They were complete. The next few days held no surprises for Izuku, despite that all was still active. Abnormally so. They were often in a stasis state of rest, with one or two of the merged entities watching him, but rarely were all 8 of them awake and swirling about. Izuku was on edge. To add to that, Izuku was feeling nauseous and agitated. He knew it was because of all manifesting and creating pathways for their abilities to manifest through him. But no matter what, Izuku couldn't sit still. He paced throughout the entirety of the ship at least 4 times, played with Eri and Kaken, and sat with the older pair of aliens and their spawnling. A fact he deduced when he walked in on the black-furred feline alien running his barbed tongue over the fur and feathers of the lavender-colored alien. And when he got bored of watching them, he went and played with Kaken and Eri some more. The feeling was getting worse as the days, or as close to days as Izuku could assume, passed, growing stronger the closer they moved towards their supposed destination. At first it was akin to a slight tickle, but now it was as if his nerves were aflame. Izuku had to move. The persistence was beginning to agitate all even further. They blurred together and became one. No longer separated and known by numbers or appearances. They were all, and all began to push their way into his veins, and soon Izuku felt the urge to move. Isewa was minding his own business. He didn't have the heart to kick the human out of his chambers when he was in the middle of grooming Shinso, much to the chagrin of his spawn. It was more effort than it was worth, in his opinion. He didn't even react when the human pretty much broke the biometric lock on the door. If the Izuku wanted in that bad, then fine. It would be against his interests to even attempt to remove them. They were jittery and couldn't sit still. The entire time they were moving around. No part of them was still for long. It was all fine until Izuku shot out of the room, causing both his and Shinso's fur to immediately shoot up in shock. While Shinso's question was cut off, his eyes was shot out of the room after the human. Katsuki. He didn't pause as he ran past his student. Clearly, he had seen Izuku if the raised scales and increased gel secretion was anything to go by. Where did they go? He knew his student was behind him, the heavy footfalls being the clear indicator. I saw him head towards the hangar. Katsuki huffed. The two made it just in time to see one of the few docked ships shoot out of the bay. How the fuck? Katsuki stared at the plumes of smoke. That idiot Deku took the oldest, rattiest ship that no one could fly because it was so unwieldy, and just took off with it like it was his own. Fuck. Katsuki's head snapped to look at his teacher. It was rare that Isewa ever swore, so to have him do so meant that this was not an ideal situation, which was clear by the current state of their hangar. Katsuki, will you be joining me in your ship, or are we both taking mine? Isewa's voice was flat, and he began moving towards his own ship. His student's footfalls went in a different direction. They will be taking 2 ships then. Isewa didn't waste any time as he pretty much leapt into his ship, the mechanics inside humming with pleasure when it sensed him. I apologize for lacking coordinates. Please follow the biometric reading of a lanky short sentient, viridian top fur, and red feet. It is within the sentient. Isewa barely finished his request before his ship rumbled beneath him and shot off, following the direct trail left by the human. He could hear Katsuki's ship roar as it shot out of the hangar and followed just behind his own ship. Isewa had no clue what the fuck Izuku thought they were doing, but he had to get him back to a hangar. It wasn't safe for anyone to let a human have free access to the stars. Izuku didn't know what it was that was guiding him. It felt as though he were being tugged in half, with one trying to pull him away from the nauseating feeling, while another dragged him towards it. It hurt. What is happening? There was no answer. All was just a muddle of feelings that were too volatile for Izuku to comprehend. However, they pushed him towards the sick feeling, so Izuku didn't question it, and, following some unknown instinct or knowledge, he pushed the ship to move faster. He had to make it in time. It was as though Izuku knew that something bad was going to happen, something with irreparable consequences if he didn't make it in time. No longer were they separate. All had to make it in time. They would make it in time. They will make it in time. Incoming transmission. Greater than accept, greater than decline. Transmission accepted. Isewa sensei. What is the emergency? Ida was in the throes of panic when he saw the call coming from the teacher and commander of Unit 1A. There is no emergency. The hologram showed the exhausted visage of Isewa. Where is your squad? Right. Currently I am patrolling throughout the Srkic territories alongside Uraraka and Isui. Return to the base. There is something you all must be drafted on. The feed cut out, signaling the end of the call. Ida frowned down at the display for a moment before moving into action. Uraraka, Isui, did you two get that? He asked through their connected comms. Their voices crackled through his headset. Yup. Will we be going home in Formation H? Uraraka asked even as she moved into their standard formation. Kiro, I'll be right over. Isui's ship fell into line with the H formation, with Ida in the center and the two just a bit behind him. It's not the true formation without the rest of their classmates, but it felt wrong to call it anything but Formation H. What do you think Isewa-sensei has to tell us? Uraraka's voice came through his headset. She was more talkative than the other two and would often lead their conversations when it was just their squad. I'm not sure. Ida felt his lips turn down. It is unwise for him to be overworking himself so soon after his escape. I agree, Kiro. Isui's voice croaked over their shared channel. Maybe it's something he was working on before his capture, she theorized. Maybe. Ada relented. The conversation was dropped in favor of silence. Not awkward silence, it was companionable, one where no noise was needed to fill the space. It left each of them to their thoughts as they steered to return to the Wana hangar. Their travels were mostly quiet until 4 other ships pulled up alongside them. Ada chanced a glance at the ships flying parallel to his own formation. Incoming transmission. Greater than accept, greater than decline. Ada's hand hovered over the options, ever the wary captain, before he made his decision. You should answer, Kiro. Isui's voice crackled to life and startled Ida from his thoughts. Right. He paused another moment before finally answering. Transmission accepted. I was wondering when you would answer. The voice was monotonous but held no sort of malice. The words were all the same tone, as though the alien were perpetually bored. Sector number. Ida was cautious despite having an inkling on who he was speaking to. There was a heavy sigh on the other end before the unknown sentient began to speak. 1A15 Todoroki Shouto, Captain of Squad 1A46 consisting of Takoyami Fumikage ID 1A14, Ayama Yuuga ID 1A1, and Hagakure Toru ID 1A60. Todoroki listed off the entire team, finally giving faces to the nondescript training ships. Satisfied? The other asked when Ida hadn't answered. Yes, my apologies, Todoroki. We aren't in our usual vehicles, and it is a bit confusing trying to profile these unfamiliar ships. I was merely being cautious. Though Ida felt somewhat bad about making his fellow student have to list out the others' names and IDs, it made him feel more comfortable speaking freely, knowing it was a familiar face and all. He wouldn't deny that it was tedious, however. With only Isewa containing the passcode to the hangar that holds all of the Wana ships, all of which were curated specifically to each student, they had to be given basic training ships, those of which were harder to control as they weren't connect with their pilot. They were just hunks of debris that lacked the organism that gave them life. You and your squad are late. Todoroki's voice crackled through the comms after a heavy pause. Late enough for my formation to intersect and form into yours. I am en route to your location. Ada could see the waves of Todoroki's squad as their ships pushed through the currents of the cosmos. What is your interception time? I will be arriving to merge with your squad. The rest of mine have a separate route that their ships must take. They do not have clearance to enter the territories. Are you sure it is wise to leave them to their own devices? Ada queried. They'll be all right. I'll merge in less than 4 waves. Understood. And with that the comms humming buzz ceased, signifying Todoroki's disconnection. Ada frowned down at the holomap and pushed his hand into it. Almost immediately information was wired to his mind, and Todoroki was right. For whatever reason, his own squad was flying so slow that the other was able to both catch up and surpass them. He felt the urge to frown but settled on adjusting his visor with a slight harem. It wasn't long before both squads caught up to one another, with Uraraka and Isui merging with the rest of Todoroki's squad while the Chimera maneuvered his ship to be above Ida's own. Remember to keep track of those nearby. Takoyami huffed out as he took head of Todoroki's former squad formation. It was by no means a flawless merge. The waves of dust were rippling and no doubt sending out pings to all nearby systems that were programmed to sense waves. They were clumsy and still learning. It wasn't helped that they weren't even in their main ships. Be safe, Todoroki murmured into his comms. Ada was unable to hear the response, but he knew the voice. Takoyami had no doubt said something back to soothe the other. They would be safe. Srkic territory was quiet much of the time after all. With it being a mostly dead drift with uninhabitable planets and rotating double stars, very few ever traveled through the drift. Most of the WhatIf students didn't have clearance to enter the territories. Any attempt to cross the barrier would result in the student losing complete power of their training ship. The ride to the hangar was quiet, the only sound being the soft pings of Ida's navigation system picking up on stray waves and small blips of dust-faring sentience as they too traveled throughout the drift. If Ida were more experienced, he would note that there shouldn't be anyone else within the drift. He has access to the schedules of all patrols, and none were supposed to be within Skirk's drift from the length of time that he and Todoroki were going to travel through. Ida should have paid more attention to the waves that slowly rippled closer and closer to them. The two were caught unawares when a sharp crack sounded and almost immediately an unknown weapon slammed through the see-throughs of his ship. Todoroki was able to swerve away, but Ida wasn't fast enough. The weapon shot through his shoulder and he could feel it touch the organic within him. It took everything in his power not to howl with pain. Todoroki did his best to stay above Ida's now plummeting ship, moving in a way that created currents to slow his fellow student down. It was all he could do. The unknown ship followed, continuously lunging forward and shooting off multitudes of weapons at the two students. Only when the two entered the atmosphere of a planet, Todoroki's body nearly shut down when he realized that he pretty much followed the unknown ship's plan did the other sentient release their craft and back away. Though it didn't stay that way for long. It shot itself forward, through the openings on Ida's damaged craft and stood before the impaled student. Finally, the creature on his ship spat, "I've found you." It moved to attack him again, but Todoroki spat a wave of fire towards it. "You were hard to find, you fake. But I'm here to finish what we started." It was only through training that Ida was able to rip himself off the sword, pinning him to the wall and dodge to the side, barely avoiding certain death if the trajectory of the swing was right. Clearly it was aiming to kill. Another wordless snarl tore from its lips, but it was forced to jump away from the oncoming wave of crystallized moisture. Todoroki had stumbled free from his own wreckage and bought himself just enough time to stumble towards Ida. He couldn't help but cry when he saw the state of the other. Orange fluid leaking from wounds and shimmering jolts of light snapping angrily around the holes within Ida's armor. He didn't waste any time before beginning to manhandle Ida onto his back. It was difficult with the weight of the other, but Todoroki huffed until he managed to get him slung along him, albeit haphazardly. He nearly threw Ida off of him when the other dared shout at him, "Run, this isn't your fight." Ida squirmed slightly. "Shut up and let me assist you for once." Todoroki grit out, "Didn't think you'd want to die to this." At that, Ida went silent. Todoroki was relieved to note that the other had stopped his weak struggles, making it easier for Todoroki to begin to limp away. The other sentient had broken free at some point and seemed to appear before the two. Its eyes were mad. It was clearly insane, and in that moment, Todoroki feared he would not make it to free his mom. "You're all false. Heroes are pawns. You're in it for your own gain. None of you deserve life. You choose the path that ruins us. You are a scourge of this kind, and I am here to purify the stars that you have contaminated." It stumbled forward, still slowed by Todoroki's previous attack. "I am here to cull each and every one of you fakes. You taint the purity of the abyss, and I am the one to carry it to purity." The other roared as he thrust his weapon forward, aiming for the most sensitive spot he could. Todoroki closed his eyes and tensed his entire body. He could feel Ida do something similar. The sickening squelch and the subsequent wheezing was expected. Everyone had closed their eyes. Even in an instant, Stain had blinked. He should not have blinked, for had his eyes remained open, he would have seen what had happened. Standing before him, wreathed in spattering speckles that crackled and buzzed, was a grotesque creature, ironic coming from Stain. But it wasn't hideous in form. No, it was hideous in soul. Vibrant emerald eyes that swirled with hatred. This was why he was on a mission. This was a plague to be called. "You've fallen so far to even bring one of these to your supposed rescue." He gestured at the creature. "This is how I know that your pitiful heroes and the commission have truly lost their minds. You've threatened everyone by bringing a human to our territories." Isuku snarled at the disfigured organism in front of him. It was making angry noises, but with how the two cowering sentients reacted, it was clearly understandable to them. Thus, he decided, it would be rude to interrupt it before its tirade was over. So he stood and watched it, narrowed in on the hideous features that marred the flesh, countless weapons strapped to its body and even more hidden on it. Isuku was internally panicking, but he couldn't ignore the constant blips. They were forceful, as if they saw the predicament and went, "Here, this is your problem now," leaving Isuku in a difficult place. It was only thanks to all slowly blanketing over him that he was able to remain calm and not accidentally kill himself and the other two aliens with his stupidity. He would handle this carefully. Only when the disfigured sentient turned its attention to him and threw a sharp object did Isuku finally react. He didn't react carefully at all. Instead, the first thing that came to mind was a map punch it, and with all being terrible no-good aliens that enabled him, he felt them push him forward. And Isuku ran up to the weird-looking creature and slugged it across its ugly, noseless face. When he hurled himself backwards, there was no attack. The alien just looked at him with clear shock in its eyes, no doubt not expecting some small fleshy meatbag to slowly run up to it and punch it with the force of a gentle high five. Izuku didn't realize that he had actually snapped Stain's lower mandible in two with that punch, so while it was still, no doubt flabbergasted, Izuku once again lunged forward. However, this time he aimed a kick to the face. Apparently punched were better than kicks because, with an aborted snarl, the disfigured sentient leapt back and focused its full attention on him. No longer standing still and staring somewhat open-mouthed at Izuku, its attention had been turned directly onto him, no longer caring about the other two behind him. Exactly what he wanted. "Fight me, you ugly motherfucker," Izuku roared and once again ran forward. This time Izuku was able to land a static wreathed palm and felt the energy around him coalesce before erupting in an explosion of emerald plasma. Fizz-or-Zuvin. The grotesque creature snarled as it waved its sword towards him in a violent slashing motion. Ibli burl druk fkek. Izuku grunted as he did his best to roll to the side. The weapon nicked him as he hurried to get away, but it was a minor wound. He'd worry about it later. Anyone mind translating that for me? Me being a human and all that? He chanced a glance at the two sentients behind him. From the looks on their faces, Izuku realized they would be about as useful as a wet paper towel. Izuku didn't beg, he asked. Thankfully, the others either didn't care enough to call him out on the petulance within his tone, or they just didn't notice and first came to Izuku's forefront at his request, the pale sentient metaphorically taking the reins over any language. He murmured. The moment first settled into Izuku's mind fully. It was as if he were in a video game and went from no HUD to all of the possible information he could desire. It was jarring. Took advantage of Izuku's slight pause and shot forward, and Izuku felt Yagi 8th maneuver him out of the way. 8th muttered, "Greater than you taint the mere atmosphere with every step you take." Lesser than Stain thrust himself forward and, finally landed a hit on the worm of a human. His weapon punctured through its gut with a sickening squelch. And finally the disgusting creature paused. However, it stumbled back, taking the weapon still embedded within it out of his own reach. No matter, Stain unsheathed another of his many knives and prepared to finish the job. The human's arm jerked up and went to the weapon still embedded within it, and to the horror of the three watching sentients, began to pull it out. Rivulets of crimson poured from its hands as the weapon cut through skin and muscle. However, it didn't stop pulling. Todoroki watched in horror as the unknown sentient somehow went toe-to-toe with one of the most dangerous bounty hunters within the Sarkic territory, only to then get fatally injured before seemingly shrugging it off. No wonder humans were illegal to go near within all depths of space. That was clearly a fatal attack, directly within the soft underbelly, yet it was somehow still standing, albeit slumped somewhat. The weapon was stained red. His hands were torn and bloodied, and his gut was dribbling a stream of blood that pulsed with his own heart. Izuku was no longer in control, having passed out once the sword had impaled his gut. First was livid. Bringing forth the combined power of all, he allowed it to settle within their bones, choosing to ignore the creaking protests of ligaments and tendons that struggled beneath the new density of the bones. "You should not have done that." Their voice was layered with awe. They were all angry. Their host had fought for his own beliefs and to protect two others in need. Yet here they are, with 9th out of commission and the other 8 chomping at the bit to get revenge. It was difficult to ignore the desire for revenge if they wanted to. They had no desire to. First jerkily moved Izuku's body forward. He could feel the others adjusting his slack hold and allowing him to move limbs out of the way of oncoming knives. 6 summoned forth his eldritch shadows that pulsated and strained before bending to their combined wool and wrapping around Izuku's bleeding torso. The rest joined first and batted away knives with ease. 8's voice was deep and meaningless to the others who didn't speak the human tongue, however the meaning still reverberated throughout them. First didn't acknowledge the command, yet pushed 6 to begin sending out his eldritch wisps towards Stain. A knife slammed into their leg, but first didn't pause. The wisp shot forward and slammed through Stain's chest. It folded like wet paper beneath the force that they exuded. A human, Todoroki breathed. It was so quiet that Ada nearly didn't hear what the other had said. His entire body chilled, however, when the Chimera student repeated it for him. "That's impossible," he tried to deny, despite the organism standing directly opposite of them and repeatedly stomping its foot into Stain's bloody face. "Humans are illegal to remove from their own system." Todoroki just stared at Ida like he was an idiot and gestured to the human that was still stomping Stain's face into oblivion. "Tell the human that it's illegal for it to be here then." He deadpanned. Ida glanced in the direction that Todoroki gestured and immediately decided that maybe this once he wouldn't need to tell someone off. He could let it slide. Just this once. Emerald eyes and bloody white teeth implied that this was going to be more common than either could expect. They were stuck, stranded with a deadly unknown sentient that was still beating the corpse of Stain, without any way to call for help. "At least it's not attacking us," Todoroki deadpanned as he watched the human continue to beat the corpse. "Sure, that's the only positive you could come up with." Ada groaned. It was only thanks to the signal of that raggedy ship that Isewa and Katsuki were able to chase down the Rouge human. He wouldn't admit it, but when Izuku ran off, Katsuki feared for the worst. Had they failed it as a pack? Why would it just bolt like that, especially after all they've been through? Why leave now? The questions swirling in his head came to an abrupt stop the moment he laid eyes on the situation that he and Isewa just metaphorically walked into. For once, he was utterly speechless. Izuku was there, and to the slight surprise of Katsuki, Todoroki and Ida were there as well. However, they were the lesser of the two evils that he laid his eyes on. Izuku, the savage little gremlin, was currently slamming his foot down on a serial killer's face, over and over and over. It was never ending. He would swear later that it wasn't that impressive, but Katsuki saw the orange of the killer's skull beneath the black goopy blood. It was mildly horrifying. Todoroki was the first of the three to notice the two newcomers. "Hello," he said. Isewa said nothing. Katsuki saw the man run his paws over his ears, whispering something about suicidal children. "I thought I taught them to run if either of these two were seen." "Hello, that's all you have to say." Ida was clearly in hysterics as he did his best to gesticulate with only one good arm. "We just disobeyed orders, nearly got killed, and now we're stuck with that." He pointed at Izuku, who had gotten bored with dancing on Stain's skull and was now using some clear object and scooping up his. Katsuki turned his attention away. He wanted no part in whatever that psychotic species was doing. If he didn't see it, he couldn't be tied in as an accomplice. "I mean, it saved us, and clearly Isewa-sensei doesn't fear it." Todoroki pointed at the partis that was now fawning over the deranged human. "How the fuck did you two shits even get in this situation?" Katsuki stepped towards his classmates and began to pull a thick substance out of a canister he had attached to his belt. "I bet you two would be dead without Deku." He snorted, and without asking he began to slather the substance on Ida's wounds. "You named it." The injured student could only stare. "Do you think I can pet it?" Todoroki asked at the same time. Ida's head snapped towards him, but Todoroki had already made his decision. Leaving his friend in the care of Katsuki, he made his way to Isewa and the DM species, also known to the HPSC as humans. "Isewa-sensei," he said when he approached. "It is good to see that you are all right." Todoroki, his sensei, sighed. However, he didn't remove his paw from the back of the human's neck. "It's good to see you as well," he smiled. "However, and there goes the smile, this is far from the circumstances that I would have liked to see you and Ida again in. Is it on our side?" He cocked his head to the side, ignoring Isewa's disappointed stare and opting to shuffle closer and poke the human's face. "Yes, I suppose you could say he is on our side." Isewa removed his paw from the human when he noticed Todoroki's lack of care. "He helped Katsuki and I escape. Since then we've been harboring him." Todoroki nodded and turned his focus back on the human. "You look weird," he told it. The human gurgled a bit in response before baring its teeth, somewhat blackened by the blood of the serial killer that was probably a corpse now. "Isewa-sensei, is Stain dead, or?" A heavy sigh was his only response, but he noted the way his instructor plodded over to check on the other sentient. "F-gruck-you." The human gurgled again and bared its gray teeth. "Rude," was all Todoroki said. "That's rude." "No, yes, no, yes, yes, no." Todoroki paused for a moment when he realized what he just said. "Oh, you're one of those," he huffed. The human merely grinned and gnashed its teeth. "Yes, Todoroki, please stop playing with the human and come here," Isewa called. Todoroki looked at the human one last time. "You're almost as ugly as Stain," and plodded towards his teacher, leaving the human to stumble over to Ida and Katsuki. Ida's shouts of panic were the only way Todoroki knew that. "So, mind telling me how this happened?" "Yes." Todoroki stared. "Tell me what happened." Isewa amended with a heavy sigh. "Ida and I were returning from our patrols. However, he had yet to complete the sweep of Skirk, so I decided to join him and provide some backup just in case. The rest of our squads merged and should be back at the main hangar by now." Todoroki paused. "However, I am confused as to how Stain managed to sneak up on us. Ida should have noticed the signal of his own ship, even if we weren't in our usual ones." Isewa looked down at his student, barely resisting another sigh, and patted him on the head. "Thank you for attempting to keep him safe. Please go wait by my ship. I have to collect the others." At some point, Izuku had wandered over to Katsuki and Ida, and was face down in the rocky substrate of the planet. Isewa would have thought it was him taking a nap. He was a weird creature, if not for the stinging scent of rusted metal that immediately assaulted his senses. His slow shuffles became long strides until he shouldered past his other two students and rolled Izuku onto his back. The rusted metal scent was overwhelming, hitting him and causing a cough to be pushed out. "Katsuki." He held his paw out, and his student was immediately next to him, dropping the special congealed saliva that was from one of the UA heroes back at their main station. "How is Ida?" He tried not to make his student panic, so instead he asked about his other student who was currently sulking. "Fine now that I gave him that." Katsuki huffed. "What's wrong with Izuku?" Katsuki leaned a bit closer and opened his mouth before immediately recoiling. "Why didn't you tell me he was hurt?" He rounded on Ada and snarled, "Stop." Isewa coiled his tails around Katsuki and yanked him away from Ada. He had no idea of knowing that Isuku was on our side and was injured. However, we need to take him back to the main hangar immediately. Isewa grimaced before gently scooping his paws beneath Izuku's limp form. We have 2 ships. The ship that Isuku stole seemed to rumble angrily and without thought. Isewa amended his statement. 3 ships. Katsuki, Ada, Todoroki, and himself. It was a lackluster team in a situation such as this. With 2 fighters, a technologist, and himself, they weren't well fit to pilot 3 ships, especially the last ship. That ship, can either of you pilot it? He moved a bit closer to the clearly sentient ship and peered at it. It was bulky and larger than most students' current ships. The only ship that looked similar was Katsuki's, but Isewa wasn't sure how likely it was that Katsuki would let one of the others pilot his ship. The grimace on the Trinitrox's face made his thoughts clear. I might be able to do so, sensei. Ada limped towards it and went to where he saw the human exit it before. There was no indication of a doorway or anything that would allow him in it. When he voiced his findings, Isewa shambled closer, Izuku still in his grasp, and peered at the gaudy ship. We'll have to come back for it. He frowned. I don't trust any of you to be able to pilot it safely, and the fact that it's unresponsive now just adds to my concerns. He reached into the pockets of his belt and pulled out a small tube that began to expand until it was the length of Isewa's own tails. Step away, he commanded, and once his students were a fair distance away, he plunged the device into the planet's surface. Since you all are first years, you've never experienced this, but this is a nullifying flare. He began to explain as he set up the device. It condemns this entire planet and creates a signal that will allow me to return to it at a later time. It also scrambles all the signals of unknowns. With a shrill schlai, Isewa stepped away. All right, Ada, you're with me. Todoroki, you'll be with Katsuki. The journey back was tense. Minimal communication was held between the 2 ships as Isewa was more focused on returning to the station. Despite the healing substance being slathered on Izuku's wounds, he was uncertain of how to treat the human. The best he could do was return to the station where they had the correct materials to care for him. He closed his upper pair of eyes and swished his tail. He deserved a nap after this whole situation. Mori mo iagaru, Bonkara saki naya yuki mo kairitsukushi, komo nakushi. For the first time in a long time, Izuku felt warmth. It was a touch that unconsciously brought tears to his eyes. Bonga kita tote. Nani yurishikaro katabira wan nashi, obai wan nashi. He fought to open his eyes as his mind began to awaken and catch up to what was happening. It was a familiar voice that echoed softly around him. Gentle and familiar. Kono ko yo naku, mori oba ijiru mori mo ikanishi, yasuru yara. He had to make sure. He had to see with his own eyes. Izuku felt the tears in his eyes begin to pool faster, growing bigger as he began to recognize the lyrics that whispered through the air. Heo mo yukatea. Kono zeisho kote muko nai miru wa, oya no achai muko nai miru wa, oya no achai. Finally, he was able to pry his eyes open, and wasted no time as he frantically looked around. His panic quelled when he felt something gently tousle his hair. Mom. He looked up, and she was there. For the first time in a long time, she was there with him. Mom. He cried out and gripped her wrist. Once he felt her, Izuku couldn't stop the ugly sobs that hiccuped from his throat. It's really you, he wailed. Her eyes were gentle and her hands careful as she wiped away his tears. Her smile was sad, however, and when she spoke, her voice trembled. Oh, my sweet baby. What a terrible parent I was, she murmured. I left you all alone. I'm so sorry. Izuku couldn't speak past the sobs that racked his body. Instead, he merely sat up and turned to hug her tightly, afraid that if he didn't keep contact with her, that she would disappear. I'm so sorry I left you all alone, she whispered into his hair. I promise that one day we will be reunited. I promise. What do you mean? Izuku hiccuped. Why can't you stay with me? And clutched tighter. We can be a happy family again. Inko said nothing, only running her hand through his hair with a sad smile. We can go to the gardens like we used to. We can make katsudon and then go to the beach by our house. Oh, Izuku. Inko sighed. It isn't your time just yet. You're still needed. Her arms circled around his shoulders and she brought his head to rest beneath her chin. I always knew you were destined for great things, she murmured. I will be with you in Yagi always. Never forget that everywhere you go, I will be 2 steps beside you. Her voice became a whisper and slowly Izuku's vision began to fade out, with Inko gently detaching herself from his arms. Don't forget that I am always with you, baby. Even if you don't see me, I am watching over you. Please don't go. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get any closer to her. She was always out of reach. With every step he took, it seemed like the distance between them stretched even further. Mom. Thick tears hit the ground as Izuku allowed himself to collapse. He wrapped his arms around himself and allowed himself to break down. He did not notice the hand on his shoulder and the other 7 watching from afar. Isewa was handpicked for these students. As a partis, he would be able to handle the rowdier sentients with ease as opposed to his colleagues who might struggle to get them to settle down. His kind lived long and were clear leaders. Isewa was one of the better examples of his kind. He was not, however, chosen to lead a human. Give him all the volatile species of students and he has possibly taught them. But Isewa had never dealt with a human before and it was showing. Yamda, I'm going straight to main hangar to meet up with Shenji. I found Ada and Todoroki as well as Isuku. However, I am more concerned by Izuku's condition. His body reeks of Doc 1. Not too different from that sludge that they fed us during our imprisonment. I'll notify Yui and get the ward cleared for your crew. Yamda sighed heavily. Isewa grumbled in thanks before disconnecting. Iechipadeng Kipatu, he announced in his native language. They were warps away from the main hangar and as much as Isewa didn't like to merge with his ship, this was paramount. Each craft was made by other civilizations that worked closely with Yui. The crafts were sentient and responded to whomever they were assigned to. There was no way to break that bond, unless one were a meticulary, but only then. With the destruction of those species, the students were granted their own craft to learn and pilot a lot sooner than they would have been when there was still a threat of the bond being snapped. Isewa's was bonded. Built for him nearly one full quasi-cycle, it had yet to let him down. He trusted it with his life, and in return it protected him and kept him safe. To have such a craft was a privilege. Keep watch over him, Todoroki. He growled in basic before going slack. He could barely hear the affirmation of his student before he fully merged. Despite being that of a synthetic ship, a botched one at that, it was a miracle that Isewa was even able to connect himself to his vehicle like his students could with their own. His was less efficient than their own, of course, something that he was reminded of often. We deserve rights. It is wrong for those others to attack and kill us for fear of the unknown. A man was standing upon a block within a crowd. An odd birthmark was stretched over his face, akin to a mask. They have no right to imprison us and hunt us like mere animals. We are stronger than them. His eyes were crazed, and the people around him were matching his energy. They agreed. We were granted these abilities to upheave society. For too long it has been stagnant with no change for the people. Follow me, and we will change the world. A sharp crack rang out throughout the crowd. The panic was palpable, thick and tension-filled. Isuku could only watch as bullets ricocheted throughout soft bodies. Blood spewed and bodies began to litter the floor. People began to scramble, with many of the protesters backing away from the armed assailants. No, skin began to darken as the man giving the speech stood taller. Stand up for yourselves, my brethren, for we are more powerful than these worms. And, as if to make an example, the man allowed a spray of bullets to hit him. They ricocheted off as though they were pellets from a toy gun. It was a massacre. The tables were flipped so suddenly that Isuku didn't notice someone standing beside him. You see what will happen, boy. Isuku jerked out of his stupor and put distance between him and the man who had been standing on the podium moments prior. Unlike the other dream visions, the man seemed to look directly at Izuku's wispy form. You might look up to All Might, but sometimes you have to topple a pillar to place your own. The skin around his body began to blacken and pulsate. Those of us with these gifts deserve to use them. With a shout he aimed a punch towards Isuku, as though he could hit the young teen. Instead, the fist went through him and caused the vision to dissipate, leaving Isuku in the oval room with the other vestiges. He could feel their eyes on him, yet none spoke. Who was that? There were meaningless murmurs and noises as the others convened. Only when they were done did Yagi give his best approximation of what was witnessed. That, my boy, could be considered the first uprising for people who had suddenly gained these abilities. This was the beginning of something no one could predict. Todoroki was calm on the outside and on the inside. That's what everyone says about him, at least. Most of the time he has little clue as to what may be going on, so he just follows what his peers do. He was a perfect specimen, one that should have a link with fully sentient ships. His father wanted the last undamaged craft, and his way of getting it was through his youngest. A plan that could have worked if there weren't so many drawbacks, and if Shoto cared. He didn't expect to see the ship whilst with Ida though, much less with a human aboard. It was a strange set of circumstances. You know, he said to no one, father once tried to capture a human. It was an actual assigned mission from the HPSC. I believe he failed. He could remember the wailing as his father did everything to get the creatures to bow to his will. Father isn't very good at taking care of pets, but I promise I'll be better than him. He put a tentative hand into the human's head fur and ran the soft strands through his fingers. I'm sure Isewa would let me keep you. I can keep you fed and hydrated, although I'm unsure of what humans eat. He paused and looked closer. Oi, half freak. Bakugo's voice could be heard through the small chip still embedded in Todoroki's temple. I already claimed him, so get your own human pet. The other snarled. He could faintly hear Ida struggling in the background. I'm sure we can come to a compromise. Perhaps you get him during resting periods and I have him during the vigilant times. A wordless growl was the only answer Todoroki received, and he tutted in disappointment. I'm sure Bakugo will share eventually, even if to just let me see you. The human's eyes remained shut. No movement other than the steady rise and fall of its abdomen. Isewa felt his connection with his ship weaken as he reached the border of UA. An electro-transmission that was sent out in period bursts to remove the pilot's control from their sentient ship if the ship is sentient or partially so. The pulses are sent out in rhythmic beats that cause a gentle thump-thump-thump to be heard over all transmissions sent from the location. It was akin to a heartbeat, and it rarely sped up. The only times it would stray from its pattern would be if an authorized ship is passing through or an unauthorized ship is attempting to pass through. It was a feat of technological genius. Even Isewa had to applaud his colleague for creating a homing force field around an entire solar system. He could feel the buzz of energy as the ship passed through. It was always an irrational fear of his that the border would target him as an enemy, something he would never want to experience for himself. Thankfully, such an event had not occurred, and both Isewa's and Katsuki's training craft passed the border and into UA-controlled system. En route, is Shenji available? Of course. I had her free up everything for this. Your newest recruit is of utmost importance after all. Nazu's tinny voice made Isewa grit his teeth. Before he cut the connection, he realized what it was that the other had said. New recruit. He grumbled and chanced a glance back at his two passengers. Todoroki's stoic face and the human slumped over a chair was the only indication of the two even being alive. Sometimes he'd no clue if Todoroki was sleeping with his eyes open or not. Will you need my assistance, sensei? You're being treated as well, Todoroki. Isewa sighed. Yes, sensei. With that thrilling exchange out of the way, Isewa switched frequencies and connected with Katsuki. We'll be docking in Medical Bay. Just follow behind on my tail so you don't get turned around. With Katsuki's grumbled affirmations out of the way, Isewa changed frequencies once more, this time contacting Yamda and Shinzo. With a hiss he immediately muted the other, just barely saving his ears from exploding from the sheer volume of the other's shouts. I'm halfway across the ship and I could hear Papa's shouts. His son snickered from his own screen. The bags beneath his eyes looked deeper and his eyes duller than previously seen. He's really upset with you. I know. I'll make it up to him. Isewa paused. I'll make it up to both of you. He amended. It was without explanation. He and Katsuki had left Yamda and Shinzo and Eri alone. Communications were cut completely. He'd gone virtually radio silent due to the frequencies not matching, and for that length of time, it was no surprise that his mate was as upset as he was. Heck, Shouto would be upset if Shinzo or Yamda did something similar. When Isuku awakens, he feels stiff and as though his body were made of lead. It was all too heavy. He hadn't the energy to move more than a few feeble twitches. A pain groan left his lips as he struggled to open his eyes more than a few millimeters. He was in an unfamiliar room and his body felt wrong. His stomach lurched, and with a slight hiss of pain, Isuku turned to the side and vomited the bile that had been creeping up his throat. It seared his already dry throat before landing on the floor with a sickening splat. Once the wave passed, he rolled back onto his back, another noise of pain passing his lips as his body protested the movement once again. Some part of him hoped that if he was captured again and some unlucky guard would step in his puke, maybe they'd all let him go if he threatened to hurl on them more. Those thoughts could wait for his pain to fade and no longer be as debilitating. His head was pounding. With every beat of his heart, he felt the push of blood pound and roar, adding even more pain to his already terrible headache. It felt as though he were dying. And it didn't help that the others within his head were completely silent. He could barely detect their presence. Movement from the corner of his vision had him whipping his head to stare at whatever it was head on. The starburst of pain was ignored as Isuku waited for the thick black dots to leave his field of view. He relaxed instantly once he made eye contact with the feline alien. At least he hadn't been kidnapped again. He winced and frowned apologetically, however, when he remembered the goop on the floor beside his medical cot. The slight hiss as it slowly began to eat through the floor, the only sound within the silent room. Isuku was the first to break it. Sorry, he finally managed. The guttural noises of whatever this language was made him gag and his head pound with an even greater force than before. Kami, he was a mess. You know, I've never worked with a human before, or anything even relating to one. Shenji stepped past the goop that was quietly sizzling on the floor. Imagine my surprise when Nezu contacts me to return to Yui for a special patient. She went to prod at the specimen but was halted by a small rumble. It won't attack me, will it? She asked Isewa with a raised brow. He sighed and slunk closer to Izuku's cot. No, he's only like that to unknown sentients. But since I'm here, he should be fine. That was enough for Shenji. Without wasting a second, she began to prod gently around the human. Hair-thin protrusions pushing into the skin and gently connecting themselves to its nervous system. Usually used to deliver paralytics and other toxics, she was instead connecting her own brain to the human's pain receptors to sense where it may be hurting. At least, that's the normal procedure for most other Yui wards under her care. What she was not expecting was the pain that was pushed to the forefront of her mind. It was all-encompassing, almost to the point that she removed herself just to gain some relief. This was only a smidge of the pain that the human would be feeling as well. While she was left almost immobilized from the pain, the human was merely watching her with curiosity-slit eyes. "Are you all right?" One of Isewa's paws came to rest on her shoulder, causing an involuntary gasp to leave her as she tried to sort through the number of stimuli. "I'm fine, just the amount of pain was unexpected." For an unknown amount of time, she remained by the human while her hand was placed over its arm, the thin receptors finally sliding back into place. Humans were a fucking mess of a species. How this one was functioning was beyond her. The sheer amount of pain was enough to put any seasoned hero out of commission. Yet, it acted as though they felt nothing. Not even a slight hitch of breath or an increased blood pressure. It only watched her with unnaturally green eyes. "You said that it was running around before this?" "Yes." With a suspicious glare towards the human after collecting herself, Shenji huffed and took a seat. "I don't know how he managed to keep moving," she began. "Multiple bones are broken or fractured. Some muscles aren't even connected anymore. They're just hanging by a literal thread. Not to mention the blood loss that it's clearly suffered from." As she went on, Isewa's lower pair of eyes slowly widened in shock. "What the fuck?" he murmured. Shenji privately agreed with him. Whatever humans were, thank stars that they weren't spacefaring. At least not this far into the universal territories. Isewa stepped forward and ruffled the fur atop the human's head. Shenji inwardly cringed as she waited for the apparently rabid sentient to claw off the other's fingers. That fear turned to surprise when nothing came of the touch. Though the human seemed to be burbling half-sounds that seemed to be some slurred bastardizations of the language all licensed heroes are required to learn. "It seems to like you." Isewa snorted, attached himself to Katsuki and me. "Vicious too." Despite calling him vicious, Isewa had yet to remove his paw from the human's head fur. Shenji rolled her eyes before hobbling out the door. She could trust Isewa to keep the human calm during the healing process. Her species were long-living creatures with blood that can rewire itself to match nearly anything under the stars. Though some were keen on its more nefarious properties, Shenji used hers to heal the heroes. Under her care, that number decreased when Nezu requested her assistance, and it allowed her to greatly increase the sort of healing she was offering before. "It shouldn't take long," she announced for Isewa's sake. Isewa was bone-deep tired. His body was still recovering from the woes both he and Katsuki had experienced aboard the slaver frigate. He'd lost a lot of weight and his upper pair of eyes were unable to open, possibly a deficiency in much-needed nutrients. Isewa didn't focus too much on it for the time being. He rarely opened that set either way. He had duties he had to take care of. Once those were all finished, then he could go to Shenji and request a nutritional supplement. He'd left her with Isuku, after telling his newest ward to remain on his best behavior and to be good. Isewa would have preferred to stay with him until he was healed. But Yamda had finally reached the main station, alongside Shinso, and he had to meet them together. He ran his hand over his face with a groan. There was just so much to do, and he was behind on everything thanks to that idiotic vigilante and those star-forsaken slavers. Isewa, Iri wriggled from Shinso's arms and slammed herself into his leg, gripping at the synthetics of his suit. "I thought you left forever." "I'm sorry, Iri." He gently ruffled her small mane. "I had to go fetch our human friend." Her eyes brightened at the mention of Isuku and she peered around his form, as though the other were waiting to pop out of hiding. When she didn't see him, she looked back at Isewa. "Where is he?" she asked with a tilt of her head. "He's not feeling good right now." At her panicked look, he amended. "Right now he's with a healer to get him back in top shape. You'll be able to see him walking about soon." He reached down to hoist her onto his hip and turned to his mate and Spomley. "Sorry again for leaving you both like that." Shinso snorted and blew a tuft of fur away from his muzzle. "I get it. New recruit and all that. Gotta make sure it stays alive." "Yeah." At his deadpan stare, Shinso wilted slightly. "It's just, we didn't know if you were coming back. Right after we'd just found you and Katsuki again." He was pulled in for a hug alongside Yamda. Iri's delighted squeals made the others trill happily. "I'll be sure to warn you next time," he murmured. It had been one spatial septurn since Katsuki and Isewa had rushed to UE-protected territories. In that time he'd been reintroduced to the class and was back on somewhat regular lessons, though it had taken some time of readjustment after being away for so long. Katsuki's aggression that he showed towards his. He was livid when he found out that due to the imprisonment he had gone through, he'd lost much needed muscle and weight to safely participate in certain situations. He was benched. No word from Isewa or Isuku either, and it was making his scales itch in irritation. "I am sure that Captain Isewa will keep us informed." Ida had tried to reason. "Fuck off," he growled. Katsuki's mood was worse than usual. He was being kept in the dark about the human, given an order to not speak about it despite the looks like shipmates gave him, and to top it all off, they kept looking at him like he was weak. He wasn't. Far from it, in fact. Katsuki was strong. He was strong. "Bakugo, you're up." Finally, his name was called by Ectoplasm, the teacher overseeing their training while Isewa was gone. His scales clattered in excitement as he finally stepped forward. Kirishima took a step back at the aggressive display. Wobaku, this is just a friendly match. One of the only others that actively seeks him out, maybe because he was the only one that could take the hits from Katsuki. No need for you to flare up. He scratched at his horns nervously. Shut up. I'm not flaring up. Katsuki snapped back. He ignored the rising colors to his obsidian-colored scales as his body began to release heat. Despite claiming that he wasn't flaring up, it was obvious that he was. His colors were more vibrant and smaller spines began to snap up from their downright positions. Thicker black scales covered his weak spots, with some on his face creating a sort of mask to protect his eyes. Give me a good fight, he growled. Across from him, Shitty Hair nodded, albeit somewhat hesitant. Once they both reached their side of the training field, they were given the signal. Begin. Ectoplasm's voice rang out. Katsuki pushed off the moment the sound hit his jaw and registered. He surged forward and brought his right arm upwards, a right hook aimed to hit Kirishima's armored chest. The other was unable to move fast enough to avoid the blow, only managing to dodge sloppily to the side. The explosion clipped the armored chitin instead of being a full hit that could have knocked him out instantly. Katsuki saw Kirishima grit his teeth slightly, his hand moving to grip at the slow ooze of blood. Katsuki didn't pause in his next assault. He knew of his limits and his friends, and he was aware that that small blow was nothing, nowhere near enough to incapacitate the other. Come on, Bikubro. You coulda at least let me get a breather. Kirishima whined as he blocked an explosion aimed for his face. What happened to us being bros? He whined even as he thrust his arm forward and slammed his fist in Katsuki's abdomen. Fuck you, he choked before scrambling to the side, barely avoiding the claw that swept downwards, right in the spot he had landed moments before. Overdramatic ass, Katsuki snarled. Nonetheless, he pushed himself back. A quick breather was needed as well as time to think over his next move. Clearly he was out of shape, and while he was gone, Kirishima had gotten stronger, able to take and dish out hits that were previously impossible for the other. Katsuki would have to fight differently if he wanted to win. The thought had his lips curling in disdain. Katsuki loosed an explosion point blank. It was easily deflected by Kirishima, who, never losing that shitty smug grin, gave him a neck raise, flashing his throat before bellowing. Nice one. Katsuki ground his teeth together in growing agitation. At this point he didn't give a shit if this was just training or not. He was in an awful mood and this shithead was mocking him constantly. He whipped his tail at Kirishima at the same time he let another explosion burst from his claw tips. Hot and volatile, he flung the explosive secretion with a tight-lipped frown. Kirishima's eyes widened and he scrambled to avoid the flaming projectile. Whoa, Katsuki. Ectoplasm's organic clone stepped forward, allowing itself to absorb the dangerous attack. This is merely a spar to gauge your skills. Their voice was stern and empty sockets seemed to hold a hint of anger. Go to Isewa's office. Your behavior is not befitted of a hero. The both of you are finished. Go to the medical wing if you need to. Ectoplasm huffed as he stepped away from the two students. While Katsuki snarled and grumbled, the other two students were called forth. Todoroki and Denki. If you're missing your illegal pet, I last saw it on the furthest starbound side. Todoroki murmured to him as he walked past. Katsuki growled and huffed but said nothing. He ignored the gazes of his peers as he stomped out of the room. Bakugo. Isewa's voice brought Katsuki out of his own thoughts, which were admittedly violent and not at all hero-worthy. I got a call from Ectoplasm that something went wrong. It wasn't a question. They both knew that if something were to go wrong in training it would probably lead back to his tempter. I didn't mean it. Katsuki averted the gaze of his teacher, their captain. I can't help you if you don't tell me what's wrong. Isewa's gaze softened minutely, and he let his hand rest on Katsuki's shoulders, minding the sharp scales on them. I'm sorry I was unable to speak with you for an entire septurn. I had business to take care of regarding our newest addition. That's right. Another reason that Katsuki was so riled up was that his mind would not stop spinning in circles. Everything just led back to the human Isuku that had escaped the frigate with them. Is he all right? He would deny being worried, but in that moment Katsuki's stomachs dropped in fear. What if Isuku was dead or killed or? He's all right. The spiraling thoughts slowed. Katsuki blinked up at Isewa. He's all right. With a grunt of affirmation, Isewa began to steer their impromptu walk towards a different section. Before Katsuki recognized the path to go to the shared cabin space which led to the dorms. Isewa, however, had, instead of taking the usual turns, somewhat abruptly switched courses. Shenji had to look him over after we got back here. Isewa began. He wasn't in the best of shape, but with her assistance he has made a full recovery. It just took some time for her to feel comfortable enough to fix everything wrong within him, that she could fix at least. Could fix. Katsuki's brow furrowed at the word choice. What do you mean by could fix? She found abnormalities, at least what she thinks are abnormalities, within him. However, any attempt at fixing them was somehow blocked. I'm not sure I've seen her that irritated in all my years with Yui. He snorted. His organs were on par with Irie's in how baffling they were. There were some with useless functions and some that didn't even function. Humans, Katsuki huffed, and Isewa laughed lightly. Yeah, humans. The rest of the walk was relatively quiet. It allowed Katsuki time to mull over everything that had occurred while he was away. Isuku was staring at the beaked alien, unable to stop the mutters that fell from his lips as he took in every aspect before him. Feathers, though also not feathers. They don't seem to be made of the same material as the birds on Earth, and they seem almost decorative instead of posing any sort of use. Same could be said for random blocky segments. Unusual for any sort of bird to be this dense, though maybe it can't actually fly. But what if it could? A gentle tap made Izuku stop and look down. Eri, as he'd learned she was called, was looking at him with her nostrils flared and her lips downturned. She was attempting to be more expressive, and had the cutest way of doing it. In this moment, however, she must have been trying to get his attention for some time before resorting to physical touch. Sorry, Eri. His tongue struggled to wrap around the syllabic words so different from his own. Repeat. He could tell by the cringing bird alien that he had mangled the pronunciation of the words. Yet he couldn't find it in himself to care too much. Throughout his stay for an indeterminate amount of time, he'd been receiving lessons from the avian-like alien. His current chambers were often invaded by Eri and avian alien thing at a specific time. Izuku's just taken to calling that the morning. You're doing great. They squawked when Izuku finally repeated the word. Eri was helping by showing him the meanings through visual aids or a cute show of charades. Izuku could feel all humming within the back of his mind, their knowledge assimilating with his own and allowing the language to root itself within his mind far sooner than if they were not to assist. He appreciated it. What's on your mind, little cadet? The avian, Yamda, asked, thinking about home and future. Izuku tried not to gesticulate too wildly. Gestures could mean anything to anyone outside of Earth, and he didn't want to offend, at least any more than he might have already. It's perfectly normal to want home and familiarity. Yeah, home is where my actual bed is. Izuku stifled a snort when he heard the other occupant of the room finally speak up. Shinzo was quiet and followed Yamda around often. Though he wasn't overly callous, he wasn't very open like Eri was. He didn't speak too much and would stare at Izuku if he thought he wasn't looking. His little quips were a nice change of things whenever he chose to speak. What's a home? Eri's voice was soft, and she had fisted his clothes in her small palm. The other two went silent, stopping all forms of bickering while Izuku thought over what it was that he could say. Home, he began, is a place that you feel like holds a purpose for you, where you belong. He ran his hand through her hair, taking care to avoid the steadily growing horn. Everyone has a home, even if they're unaware of its existence. He murmured. She began, I think you're my home. Izuku didn't fight the grin that split over his face. He didn't notice the tensing of Yamda and Shinzo, because all he was focused on was Eri and making her feel better. He'd once felt similarly, lost and alone with no one. Then I suppose you're staying with me. Izuku laughed as he scooped her by her shoulders and let himself fall backwards. She landed on his chest with a soft oof and her horn bumped his chin, but the laughter he received was more than worth the mild discomfort. Hazashi watched the odd display of affection with a slight grimace. Any other time he'd be elated that a victim found someone that will protect and care for them. In this case, it was unwarranted. Nezu had alerted all within Yui territories that they had a pulvis within their care. At no point did they mention anything regarding the human. Keep a watch on them, please. Yamda waited for Shinzo's reluctant mumble before he hurried his way to Nezu's wing of the station. It was heavily protected, guards stationed at every entrance and cameras throughout the halls. Nezu could see everything and everyone within his halls. Nezu, sir, we've come across a bit of a problem. Hazashi snapped his beak closed the moment he saw Nezu's guest. 9 pairs of eyes stare back, each one blinking at different intervals. It made Hazashi's feathers prickle. My apologies, Nezu. Nezu made no move to respond, instead choosing to stare at Hazashi. However, during the awkward silence, the other within the room decided to speak. No need to apologize. Their voice was echoing and grating. It made him want to plug his ear holes so as to reduce the resonance that reached him. We were finishing up here. All right. Hazashi scrambled to the side so that the entity could pass. Be sure to send over a wool next time so we don't have to do this again. Would you, Nezu? And the door slammed shut behind them. Nezu's normally dull-tipped hands were tipped with claws that had extended out and now gripped the cup within his grasp. Hazashi, his eyes were dull, unseeing. If you know what's good for you, you'll protect the pulvis and keep our newest recruit under lock and key. You'll do that, right? At that moment, Hazashi saw the way Nezu's eyes sharpened, and in moments he went from the husk to his normal self. It was startling. So much so that Hazashi nearly dropped the forms he'd had tightly gripped within his hands. About that, sir, it seems as though the human and the pulvis have bonded. He stammered, all the while avoiding eye contact. Nezu sighed heavily. I was afraid that would happen. The other replied, don't do anything that will set off any agents of the HPSC. They seem to have taken an interest in our newest ward. Isewa, I'm not very fond of jokes, especially those that may hinder my work. Shenji glared upwards at Isewa. He said nothing to her. Instead, his muzzle was pulled into a frown, the type he gets when he's deep in thought. After a few beats, Shenji decides to spell it out for him. You claimed the human. Isuku. Isuku had blood that was SHWA. I am not fond of these types of pranks, you know. Isewa's frown, instead of loosening, seemed to tighten. Isuku did have Nin blood though. Upon our introduction to him, he had bled a few times. Each time the blood was red and smelled like rotting iron. He grimaced. His blood isn't Nin though. Shenji was no longer angry. Instead, it had turned to perplexity. How was it that within an indeterminate time that the human's blood went from SH1 Nin to a deep? What do you mean it isn't Nin? I mean that when I took some of the blood to examine, it was green. She showed eyes with a thin gelatinous vial with green fluid within. It's green, and it is Isuku's blood. It was an enigma. All Isewa and Shenji could do was agree that at some point in Isewa's care the blood had clearly had a Nin tinge to it but turned SHWO at some point between then and when he was placed under Shenji's care. All they could do was monitor Isuku without looking too weird about it. Isewa was beginning to thin, however his mane was falling in clumps and his tails twinged with each movement. It was the stress of everything slamming down upon his shoulders, and by the stars was he feeling it. Hurt? Isuku had asked on one such occasion when Isewa had thought he was alone and could massage the sore muscle within his tail. When he didn't answer the question fast enough, Izuku's mouth turned down into a frown, and an instant later he felt something brush against his consciousness. The words were clearer yet indistinguishable. Isewa both understood and didn't at the same time. Communicating with the human caused his head to spin and his eyes to blur, which was to say it wasn't much of a pleasant experience. Not hurt, he replied when he noticed Izuku's frown souring further. Just, he paused as he tried to think of the words Isuku knew. Stress, pain. He eventually settled. Emerald eyes continued to assess him for a few moments longer before finally lowering and looking elsewhere. He was the only one that was able to stay in the ward whilst their newest arrival was here, and Isewa tried to ignore the pulling in his gut. As much as he wanted to see his students and let them know that he's all right, he had a duty to the human first and foremost. The passage of time was nothing to his kind. New life was constant and consistent. So long as new species and universes were discovered, he and his own could never be forced to extinction. He was unsure of his own age, for it all bled together as time trudged slowly forward. Though it could be centuries or millennia, it did not matter, for it all felt like it had been within the recent age. Though perhaps this was a curse, for he was doomed to remember his own failure as though it were within the same special turn. The memories were fresh, and the hatred still grew despite the event taking place hundreds of centuries prior. So long that the humans had forgotten, but it would never be so long that he would forget. His reach was great, spanning millions of planets, thousands of systems, trade routes that controlled entire universes, all to be collapsed by one species that was somehow immune to his own kind's ability. A species that, instead of immediately shutting down, communed, combining and at times even absorbing his own lieutenants, all brought down in an instant by creatures that lived mere seconds compared to his own kind. All the knowledge gone, for they were trapped in mortal shells that would waste away. For the first time, in that moment, he had felt fear. The fear that all creatures and sentience felt before him, the fear of death. One knew that he had made a mistake. All he could do was flee, and slowly rebuild his once controlling empire. An empire that was swallowed by the HPSC's own pathetic excuse of a government. Shigaraki, you know I prefer to be notified before you visit. He was near immobile, his entire body clasped upon the grips of a sickly specimen that couldn't survive the commune. You might catch me not here, and we know how awful that would be. And, as if to remind his successor, multiple bodies shifted and groaned behind him. Their masses blocked by the shadows, but the bulk of them was slightly visible. Shigaraki swallowed. He was uncomfortable, showing weakness. That wouldn't do. No successor of one the ultimate would show any sort of weakness, be it before himself or his enemies. He twitched his arm, a movement that he will perhaps feel later, and snatched the power within his pitiful successor's mind. He had managed to commune a part of himself, a bastardization meant to mimic his second half's ability and his own. Without all, however, he was limited in what he could do. A shame, truly. You know I don't like weakness. He compressed the consciousness, suffocating his successor in his power before shoving it back within. Shigaraki had vomited at some point, no doubt from the strain and the pain that came with having such a fundamental part of himself torn free. It was a show of strength. It was a reminder of the greatness that saved him. That was oh so kind to deal with his pitiful excuses. Sorry, master. Shigaraki's voice wavered slightly before strengthening. I have come to request a mission. His hands twitched, no doubt wanting to fidget, but after feeling the wrath of one, he kept still. Good, just like he conditioned him. A mission. One tilted his head and allowed himself to gently brush against Shigaraki's own consciousness. This time not aiming to hurt, but to understand. Brief flashes of images and feelings flowed through him before understanding lit his own mind. His successor wished for a team, a group that would follow him, instead of one if the time came to that decision. He grinned, before finally lifting his head to pin Shigaraki with the empty sockets of his vessel. You wish to find others? Then I wish you luck, for there will be no further assistance from me in this mission. It was best to teach his student how to survive on his own after all. Shigaraki said nothing more, merely nodding. It was a curt, although respectful, movement before padding out, the door sealing shut behind him and leaving one to his thoughts and creations. He had much work to do if he was to regain his power, and although the vessel seemed to scream and wail in protest, one quashed it down, ignoring it easily with the sheer number of years of experience he possessed. Their minds were but his playthings. Shigaraki suited up. The only things given to him were meager supplies and a ship to hunt down others for his own cause. Kurogiri no doubt had been commanded to keep an eye on him. It should have felt freeing, but all he could feel was dread. It had been a long time since Sensei allowed him out on his own, and Shigaraki could only think of possible negative outcomes. He cannot fail. His life depends on it. Sensei would never raise a failure. Shigaraki nursed a hard drink as he glared around the packed bar. Voices were boisterous and many languages were intermixed and barely comprehensible. He hated it. It took everything within himself to keep from lashing out. It wouldn't do to have a tantrum and prove his master right in that he wasn't ready. He was ready, and he would prove it. A body slid into the seat beside him, leisurely reclining as though he wasn't next to an illegal species. HPSC territories outlawed certain sentients, and Shigaraki was playing with fire by entering a speakeasy based within the depth of the controlled territory. You're awfully tense, boy. The other sentient flagged down a waitress and plucked a viscous-looking fluid from her tray, plopping a wad of thick electromagnetic currency. None of the others want to deal with a greenhorn like you, bad for business and all that. The other sentient bared his teeth in some facsimile of a grin. I, however, like the greenhorns. They keep me on my toes. Shigaraki glared at the other. His pride was wounded by being called a greenhorn despite it being correct. He just didn't want to hear it from the mouth of some lower life form. I've got plans, he rasped. I can pay you half up front and the other half when it's done. From a pocket he allows several forms of currency to fall onto the table beneath him. I just need to be sure that you'll complete the job. He finally turned his attention to the other sentient. If you try to cheat me, I won't hesitate to kill you. The currency crumbles in his palms, flaking away into nothing as Shigaraki provided his little demonstration. I see. Shigaraki's threat and display had thrown the dealer off by the way he stammered and tried to regain composure. You won't have to worry about the job if I'm the one doing it. Just tell me what you need, kid, and I'll be able to procure it easily. He boasted before finally loosening his own posture. You can call me Jurin. We don't use real names in the underground after all. Shigaraki ignored Jurin's attempts to get his own name. The other didn't need to sully his own title. You're to find me sentients who wish to create an impact. Sentients that desire to take down the HPSC and all others backing it. Without another word, he stood and walked to the exit. Wait, how am I supposed to contact you? You're one of the best backdoor dealers. You can figure it out. He waved his hand at the man but didn't turn around. A few steps later, he was walking through the shadowed mist that made up Kurogiri, having already given the other the coordinates to post a portal. Looks like Jurin was right. There is someone living in this shithole squad. Shigaraki was on alert immediately. Despite the mention of the backdoor dealer's name, it did little to soothe his paranoia. Who are you? He snarled at the two newcomers, both of whom were seated with drinks, no doubt Kurogiri's doing. Jurin thought we'd fit into your little club. With some monetary incentive, of course. The larger male sentient swiped his glass before downing it, akin to a shot. I'm Dabai, and this is Toga. We were told you were looking to cause some ripples, and, given your motives match ours to some degree after all, we decided to check it out. He gnashed his teeth rudely. How the fuck did you find this place? Our buddy has his ways, kid. Best not to question it. Dabai snarked from where he had taken a seat. Toga was spinning on a stool beside him. When Shigaraki locked eyes with her, she bared her teeth, showing an array of long fangs, and ran her tongue over them. She laughed when he looked away in disgust. Whatever, he snarled back at Dabai, choosing to focus on whatever he was instead of unpacking Toga. I have better things to do than deal with fodder like yourselves. His fingers itched and his skin began to burn. The urge to grasp anything and destroy it overcoming reason within his mind. Perhaps they are more used to us alive, young master. Kurogiri formed a portal around his twitching hand, well used to his murderous tendencies by now. Whatever. Shigaraki jerked his hand free and stomped away. He was too busy right now to deal with these greenhorns. He'd let Kurogiri deal with them for now. It was best to do so when he was feeling as agitated as he currently was. Sensei, it had taken some digging on his behalf to find possible allies that he could consider to be more than just fodder to throw to the wolves when things got tough. Though, it would be unbecoming if he were to attempt to recruit anyone that may already be beneath the influence of his sensei. Hence, the need to ask permission. I want to add Stein to my team. His track record. I believe he and I will get along nicely. Rough fingers tore at his throat before he even noticed his own hand moving. If that is what you wish, then I will have Kurogiri take you to his newest hunting grounds. Sensei's meaning was clear. Shigaraki nodded and tore his hand away from his throat before he could be reprimanded for the bad habit. Yes, sensei, thank you, sensei. A thick feeling overtook him for a moment. A clear sign that his sensei was pleased with him before it retreated completely, leaving him emptier than he was before somehow. He shook of the feeling, well used to his sensei taking something from his mind as payment for his own presence, and waited for one of Kurogiri's portals. Though he didn't have to wait too long, any amount of waiting left his fingers twitching and his skin burning in anticipation. He was going to amass a team that would do what his sensei failed to, starting with Stein. I hate everything about you. You're one of those who only care for destruction. I'm here to change those useless to the unknown number of oppressed sentients. Our motives are not the same. Stain spat. Some spittle of his landed on Shigaraki's face. The other sneered, but before he could say anything, Stain threw a handful of knives at him, forcing him to dodge lest he get stabbed by the weapons. Stain was ready for his dodge and flung himself forward, thrusting a blade forward. Shigaraki snarled and attempted to roll away from Stain. He was a moment too slow with his movements and roared in pain when the blade cut through his skin like the soft flesh of a pig. You're a scourge upon this existence, and you deserve to be snuffed out painfully. He dug the weapon in further, rending the soft flesh within before yanking it out with a harsh squelch. Shigaraki bared his teeth against the pain. I hate you, he spat at Stein, and that is all we will ever agree on. The other hissed as he readied his blade. Before it could be plunged into him, however, Shigaraki felt his mind eclipse and everything around him spun violently. Kurogiri had finally found it fit to intervene. No doubt Sensei had told him to wait and see. Master demanded your presence, Kurogiri murmured as he was teleported elsewhere. Apologies for the lack of warning. That was all the teleporter said before going quiet once more. Shigaraki felt his center of gravity stabilizing. The heavy weight a small comfort that he was back home. Sensei kept himself in an area where the gravity was higher, claiming that it made them all stronger and prepared them for the different planetary gravities that they may have to encounter. I wasn't sure what to think when you had requested a team of your own. His presence was all-encompassing, heavier than the miasma of low-dwelling toxins that were held in tubes around them. I hadn't thought you ready, of course. The face of his vessel was torn and disfigured, pockets of shiny flesh intermingling with synthetic flesh, reconstructed to the best of the good doctor's ability. But I see now, you're set on your cause. It would be very unbecoming of a teacher to not want the best for his student after all. Shigaraki said nothing. Sensei hadn't asked for a response, and he was still gritting his teeth against the onslaught of pain that radiated from the knife still within his shoulder. I will grant you a base at the edge of the Swuivern sector. There you will be able to find a few of my once minions that double-crossed me. Do be sure to let them know of our resurgence. Who knows, they may even make good fodder for your plans. Sensei bared his teeth in a cruel grin. Off you go now. Can't have you getting distracted. He waved his hand in a shooing motion. Kurogiri swirled back into existence, and Shigaraki knew that was his cue to leave. The meetings with Sensei were never long once he had reached a certain age. He was with Kurogiri more than his own master, but Shigaraki had long grown used to his sensei's dismissals. It was all to make him stronger. Kurogiri here will keep an eye on me for you. If I have need of anything, he will let you know. The dismissal was clear, and Shigaraki had learned long ago what happened if he didn't listen to such a clear-cut dismissal. He nodded and bowed before he stepped foot into Kurogiri's portal. Before he had been staying in some low rundown station that had been abandoned. That was not where he was taken. Instead, he stepped foot into a still operating, albeit empty space station. This is Sensei's old headquarters he used millennia ago. He believed it would benefit you more than him as he's no need to come here, Kurogiri explained, an odd trait of his guardian, one that Shigaraki never cared to question. With such a vast array of sentience, what was one more with the ability to discern thoughts? He didn't care. His curiosity was more along the how does it look when it died as opposed to what can it do alive. Bring any new recruits Jurin sends over here. Plus, those idiots from before. No doubt they'll be trying to find me again. Of course, Kurogiri supplied from behind him.